Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today, it is time for Some Stuff I Missed, in which I go down some stuff I missed. Not all the stuff I missed, but some of it. Dang, you know, I really wanted to make this a shorter roundup. I went into this hoping to keep this down to like a more compact list of, I don't know, 25 or something, give myself a comparative break. Seemed that the amount of cool or interesting electronic releases didn't slow down any, with gems showing up even all the way through mid-December, so there's still an absolute ton to go through as usual. At least it's not completely maxed out like the last two roundups, which had 42 segments each. This one only has 38 segments, much more reasonable. Though one of those segments also covers 3 albums simultaneously, so that takes us to around 40 projects being highlighted today. 2025 has been unbelievably jam-packed with quality electronic music, and it's been pretty dang hard for me to keep up. A couple of these came from artists I'd ordinarily be covering in full videos, but I just didn't have the spare time for it. But we've got plenty more to look through, both from the underground side and from more recognizable names. As always, don't feel obligated to sit through this whole roundup at once if you don't want to, obviously. And you know the usual drill about all of this just being my opinions. You can feel free to disagree with them, etc. And as always, if you're interested in hearing my favorite and least favorite tracks, you can find those in a paste bin document linked in the description. Not much else to say, let's just get into it. Starting out with not one, but 2 different artists who sent something into me through the $10 tier of my Patreon page, and I decided were strong and interesting enough to spread the word about. From Stanley like Cyan, Regurgitate. Alright, we're starting off this roundup with an ambient, dub, techno, and sound collage project that was sent in to me on the $10 tier of my Patreon page, and one of the very most impressive records I've heard coming out of that tier in quite a while. Obviously, you can find my full thoughts in the Patreon text post I wrote up for it, links in the description. Also, it's not my first time hearing this artist. I once did a full video review for this guy's 2022 album, Constructed Directions. But despite having less to say about this project than that one, I ended up enjoying this even more. Tracks 1, 2, and 4 of this album were legit excellent, delivering all these steadily evolving mixes of dub and techno and ambient that remind me of something like The Orb's Moonbuilding 2703 AD, and throw so many cool and immersive ideas and interesting hooks and found sound sample mashups over a steadily thumping groove, and making great use of extended track lengths. Meanwhile, the rest of the album focuses much more on, much more abstract blends of experimental noise, which, while not quite as investing for me, are still pretty dang interesting and well-textured for what they are. The album might run on a tad long, and it is very front-loaded for me, kinda runs out of steam at the very end, but even with that in mind, there's definitely a special experience you can get out of this album that you won't be getting to the same degree out of any other project that came out this year, and the production quality is great too, so yeah, needless to say, this deserves much more attention than it's currently getting, so definitely make sure to give it a shot if your musical taste happens to resemble mine in any way. Feeling a very strong 7.7 out of 10 on it. Next up from Russian Prada, Heaven. And on a surprisingly directly related note, here's a different ambient artist also combining elements of dub and sound collage and maybe some vaporwave to create another very expansive and well-textured experience in a very similar vein to this Stanley-like Cyan project I just got done talking about. This project apparently came from a particularly dark place in the artist's life, as they were really shutting themselves in a lot and feeling overwhelmed by the capitalist dystopia we find ourselves in today, hence the ironic title and album cover, or track titles like Child Machine, Statue in Flesh, or Hikikomori Haiku, or that one track which is based around the theme of getting a concussion. But I will admit that when I first wrote up my Patreon text post on the project, I hadn't actually picked up that much on the underlying darkness. I mostly just found it to be a solidly immersive and trippy experience bouncing off mysterious melodies with trip-hop beats or dub organs or other manipulated sample grooves that are just cool to listen to and sink myself into. I wouldn't say it's ever off-putting or frightening beyond a very vague sense of existential dread floating through the background of the whole thing. I wouldn't call it calming, but I do think it is more easily accessible than it looks. In any case, I did find the experience to be quite creative and interesting to listen to, and I can also recommend this to people who might be fans of ambient dub and sound collage and that kind of thing. I'll give this a 7.5 out of 10. Next up from Yarni, Anemoia. Alright, I'll admit this album barely qualifies as electronic at all. There's synths on some tracks, but this is mostly like a jazz, disco, and neo-soul kind of affair, primarily driven by live instrumentation. Although, I felt like it qualified just enough given this artist's background in making more straightforward but textured deep house music, as well as my own background covering projects from, say, Michael Menner and the Pretty Fantastics, which sit along a similar genre border. And B, seeing it going kinda overlooked, I felt like it could really stand to get more attention, and I may as well be shouting it out myself. I was particularly excited for this album, mainly off the promise of the EP Yarni put out last year called Little Island, which completely caught me off guard and ended up being like this especially sunny and uplifting and emotional experience with lots of lush and dense live instrumentation, playing into house, disco, and down-tempo based arrangements. This album does ever so slightly lean away from the electronic influences and more towards the jazz and neo-soul influences, trying to recapture the kinds of emotions and feelings that his favorite old records from the 70s could instill in him. And yeah, it's also great, at least about equally on par with the Little Island EP. I can fairly easily call it my favorite of his full-length studio albums so far. It goes without saying at this point that the production quality on this album is amazing and all the instrumental blends are super warm and well-textured. Horns, live drums, trumpets, saxophones, flutes, strings, bass, piano, and more. These mixes are so sunny, organic, and uplifting that I listened to this album one day when I had a cold and felt like the music itself was starting to clear up my sinuses. But where maybe other projects of his, like, say, the Pigna album from 2022 could maybe run together and it sounds a bit, Anemoia definitely brings in more than enough variety to consistently keep my attention. My favorite cuts were all the more energetic ones, be it the opener Neon Gods, which was probably the album's most electronic moment, bringing in lots of squirty synth effects to go alongside its sprightly jazz fusion mix. Also really liked that little rhythmic piano breakdown near the end of the track. I also really liked the two disco pop tracks with male lead vocals in Temperatures Rising with Nathaniel Short and Locked Down with Bass Bluma. Both tracks had really strong grooves and catchy hooks, especially Temperatures Rising. That was one of my biggest favorites here. And of course I also love the two tracks with trumpeter James Atachiru, those tracks being Silent City and the closer Nino. Unsurprisingly, those were quite handily the tracks that leaned the most into the album's jazzier side and probably had the densest instrumental blends. So those were my biggest favorite tracks here, and while the remaining 5 cuts tended to go for slower and less energetic blends, they still had just as strong performances and hooks as anything else. See the smooth and silky neo-soul cuts with female vocals, such as The Romantic Ghost with Plum and SWALK with Scarlet Faye. The former was probably my favorite of the more ballady cuts here, and while the latter took a few listens to grow on me, it did highlight itself as a particularly strong emotional moment. Also shoutouts to the marginally more stripped back trip-hop mix of Spell Over Me that also brought in the full horn sections during the chorus, the more straightforward UK hip-hop and jazz crossover Natural Light with Franz Von and Jeff Darko, or the borderline interlude Sunrise Sunset that has a marginally more abstract ambient approach with Scarlet Faye providing some spoken word to go alongside it. This album is very tight and to the point at 36 minutes, but it has enough meat on its bones to feel substantive. And while some tracks do hit for me more than others, there aren't any skips for me either, and it has gotten better and better the more times I've put it on. This is just a very welcome burst of sunshine likely to brighten anyone's mood, and if you've missed it, you'll definitely want to check it out. I'm overall feeling an 8.3 out of 10 on it. Next up from Brian Eno and Beatie Wolfe, Luminal, Lateral, and Liminal.
Shaking the world up again.
Alright, here's some new stuff from the Brian Eno camp, coming off the heels of what I think was one of his better projects in quite a while with Aurum, an album that a lot of people expressed to me their strong disinterest in listening to thanks to its exclusive release on Apple Music, as well as its bad album cover. I will stand by the music itself being really good, though. Anyway, now the main thing he's promoting is this set of collaboration projects with fellow British artist Beatie Wolfe. This past June they released 2 records concurrently with each other called Luminal and Lateral, which I was originally planning to cover in the previous roundup, though then a 3rd record in this mini-series called Liminal came out in October, and I decided to push my thoughts on the full trilogy off into this roundup, since honestly, my thoughts on all three albums are really not complicated at all. Luminal is kind of like a low-key ambient folk pop kind of record, with Wolfe providing vocals throughout the project. Her voice is fairly deep and understated, and she makes a very good match for the tone of the instrumentals, mostly made out of simple stripped-back guitar and synth arrangements. It's not exactly an album that contains multitudes of ideas. All the tracks follow the same kind of general formula, but I suppose highlights for me include the mildly catchy melancholic ballad Play On, the marginally sunnier and more energetic approach to Suddenly, which probably had the strongest tune on the album for me, the particularly haunting and almost spooky Ceiling in a Lifeboat, and the somewhat unexpected dark ambient turn on penultimate track Never Was It Now, even if the project does end on a somewhat corny and overly basic note right after that in What We Are. Lateral, meanwhile, is about equally as enjoyable, although in a completely different way. This one is pure traditional Eno-style ambience, a single hour-long track called Big Empty Country, technically split up into 8 movements, although there is nothing to differentiate those movements apart from each other, and you may as well ignore the structuring altogether. It's just entirely peaceful major keypads with light individual guitar notes kind of carrying a similar mildly folksy atmosphere, blending together in a nice, comfortable subspace. Playing to a very familiar playbook, also far from the first time I've heard crossovers between ambient and folk music like this, but the blend is very nice and immersive for what it is. If you enjoyed this and haven't heard of a group called Nashville Ambient Ensemble, they might be worth looking up too. And finally, the third volume, Liminal, is kinda somewhere halfway in between the approaches of the other two, more abstract and ambient than the mostly folk-oriented Luminal, but more songful than the singular ambient piece provided by Lateral. And I enjoy it about equally as much as the other two. I definitely preferred the more abstract instrumental tracks on there over the vocal tracks. The instrumentals provided a slight bit more variety, from the more energetic guitar plucking of Procession to the more impressionistic pads of Before Life, or somewhere in between seen on Ringing Ocean or Corona. Meanwhile, much of the vocal tracks just kind of bounced off me and sounded like any other tracks that Eno might have sang himself on albums in the last decade, like The Ship or Forever and Ever No More, but with a female vocalist instead. So they're not that memorable. Although I did quite like the darker process touches to the closer Shudder Like Crows, and weirdly enough, one of the other highlights, Laundry Room, showed Beatie Wolfe doing like some spoken word poem thing over another odder, darker guitar instrumental that ended up sticking out to me as cool. But yeah, that's all I got. All three records are pretty familiar territory as a longtime Eno fan, and I don't imagine I'm going to be remembering them that much longer term. The first two already kind of started slipping my mind in the time between their release and the third one's release. I definitely enjoyed Aurum more than any of these, since those pieces had a lot more definition and texture. But this stuff is all well executed enough and achieves the purposes they're going for. They worked for what they were, and all somewhat improved each other by association, so yeah, I'm willing to let the whole trilogy off with a solid 7 out of 10. Next up from Blawan? I don't know. SickElixir. Alright, here's an artist I'd seen getting some buzz around here and there. Jamie Roberts, aka Blawan, is a British DJ and producer who's been slowly picking up some hype over the past couple of years. Guy was briefly signed to R&S Records in the early 2010s, mostly self-releasing stuff in the years following, including his breakout debut album Wet Will Always Dry in 2018, which I seem to vaguely recall getting a decent bit of hype at the time, and I remember seeing that album cover circulating around, although I only just heard it for the first time while working on this segment. It's a pretty decent and fairly straightforward experimental techno record that banged pretty hard, even if not the kind of thing that stuck out in my memory. However, I feel like he picked up even more steam right after that when he signed to XL Recordings and put out EPs like 2021's Woke Up Right-Handed and 2023's Dismantled into Juice. I was recently recommended the latter in particular and gave that a listen as well out of curiosity. It's pretty impressive as far as like much more experimental bass music goes, with all the heaviness intact, filtered through a much more abstract lens. I have not heard anything else from the guy besides his 2 albums and that 1 EP. Feel free to let me know if there's anything else really cool I'm missing out on. Anyway, now he has a sophomore album, which I saw circulating around as well, and obviously inspired me to look into his stuff a bit more in the first place. And this album is pretty good. It's not quite as abstract as what I heard on Dismantled into Juice. It's a bit more accessible than that in the sense that he's trying harder to like form hooks, and there's a lot of tracks that are built around growling, heavily processed vocals. Although we're still in fairly similar territory to that EP, experimental bass music and techno that's aiming to hit on sheer force of its low end above all else. Occasionally gives me similar vibe to Sophie at her most aggressive in many parts. And certainly there's plenty of highlights to go around. The mildly off-kilter but catchy banger of an opener, the DL lights, the vocoder beatboxing of WTF, the abrupt growls of During Elevation, the more up-tempo industrial heaviness of Don't Worry We Happy and Style Teeth, the more IDM-centric and abstract ambient-influenced Creature Brigade, and the chopped-up echoing melodies of the closer and title track. Also quite like the single track with a guest feature in the track Rabbit Hole featuring Monstera Black. The addition of some female vocals in the background is pretty refreshing. Although while this entire album does effectively bang across the board, I wouldn't say there's much to say about it beyond the surface level of it being full of bangers or the production being spot on to make these mixes really full sounding and for all the bass to like hit at the maximum impact. The hooks are good and snappy enough to make sure the album doesn't run together, but if I was asked to describe each of the tracks in words, I'd have a lot of the exact same things to say about all of them. It's also not necessarily my favorite record to hit on this kind of vibe this year. I think Slickback's Attrition, while maybe not as catchy, goes a fair bit deeper and more complex with its sounds, in a way that held my interest more consistently. But hey, if all you want is catchy industrial techno bangers, SickElixir will be able to deliver that. This was a pretty fun time for what it was, all the same, and I'm overall feeling a 7.3 out of 10 on it. Next up from Marc-E, The Paradox of Fiction. Next, let's go to the random Bandcamp finds, and one of the very most under-the-radar picks I came across. Marc-E is a Canadian sideshow producer I'd never heard of until I just come across this album by pure chance clicking around Bandcamp, and seeing barely anyone having given it the time of day that I saw, and I think there was only one other person who bothered to purchase it on the site. But it turned out to be the kind of thing I definitely feel like deserves more attention, so I decided to shout it out here. This is going to be one for those who are looking for their fix in the vein of artists like Spangle and Sounds from the Ground and Magic Sound Fabric and Ott and Gabriel Lamar and all those. One of those mildly quirkier blends of psychedelic ambient dub and downtempo, which was an itch I felt like I hadn't had properly scratched in a little while. I guess the Mark Kellaway EP from earlier this year came close to filling a similar niche, but this did a better job of pinpointing that very specific SFTG loving part of my brain in a way that it just made me happy. There's only 5 tracks, but all of them are quite expansive, running on for like 7, 8, 9 minutes each, and they're all sonically well detailed with lots of organic and grooving melodic textures. I don't really have any particular preference between the 5 tracks, but all of them hit for what they're going for. Opener Maya has Middle Eastern or Indian guitar textures going up next to bubbly acid and organic downtempo beats, which sets the tone well for the kind of blend you can know what to expect. Dreamscape goes to some of those SFTG-ish formulas with some slower and more methodically crafted blends of beats and melodies. Beat His Ver might be the most upbeat and energetic cut, either that or Cave Allegory, which also features some pretty sick bass guitar licks around the corners. And the most expansive cut of them all is the 11-minute Through Glass Darkly, which felt like it had some jazz influences in its MIDI drums, but still went over lots of organic textures and striking synth riffs. Those 5 tracks might sound somewhat similar and run together a bit, but there's no skips, filler, or even a track I feel like I can pick as the least favorite. They all hit about equally. Is this album going to stick in my memory longer term? I'm not sure, but this is a particular niche in the ambient and downtempo world that I've always had a particular soft spot and always going to be game to hear more of. And Marc-E's execution of these sounds is about as on point as my favorite artists in this particular vein, so I will definitely take it. May have to pay attention to his work a bit more going forward. And obviously it's going super overlooked, so make sure to give it a spin if this genre happens to be your bag as well. I'm overall feeling a 7.5 out of 10 on it. Next up from Phonebox, The Other Side. Next up, we got a new side project of sorts from the artist more recognizably known elsewhere as Kinoteki. I quite enjoyed their album The Visitor from earlier this year, so when I saw they had another new album under this Phonebox alias, I decided to give it a shot out of curiosity. Stylistically, it's definitely recognizable as the same artist who made projects like Dawn of the Final Hour and The Visitor. A lot of the underlying compositions sound like ideas that could have fit at home well enough on either of those projects, especially the track Too Much with Vanessa Deering, which very much sounds like the kind of like melancholy burial-influenced breakbeat material that I enjoyed on The Visitor. Although that particular track is something of an outlier on the track listing in terms of its level of polish, on average, this project is deliberately going for a much more unpolished and grittier sound, with a lot of blown-out production, as well as more straightforward sample manipulations. A lot of these tracks have their sound quality intentionally compressed into oblivion and occasionally border on sounding like an AM radio broadcast, which can definitely be a bit of an acquired taste, and for me perhaps led to an experience with certain tracks that were able to hit a lot better than others. Some tracks just kind of bounced off me, like the somewhat indistinct pair of tracks that open the album, or the slightly annoying deep-fried sample chops and wiry synths of a track like Codependent. One might also expect the track Shattered Soul to not be my thing, given it's almost nothing but distorted hardcore techno kicks with no tune. Oh, I actually did not mind that one at all, thought it helped add some variety and went hard for what it was. But even if not all of these tracks hit for me equally, I absolutely cannot deny how high those highest points are able to hit. Basically any of the tracks that build themselves around some of the lusher old-school soul samples and layer some thicker lo-fi drum machine beats around them were major favorites. See tracks like the simple but soulful and sweeping See Me Fall and Could It Be Thinking About You, the energetic and bouncy tops of Mixed Signals, the hip-hop adjacent First Date, which cuts up samples of this grand epic orchestration from like the 60s or 70s that sounded really dang cool, as did the fuzzy beats and high-energy rave E-synth chords of Jane Doe, the off-kilter chopped-up pianos and introverted vocal performance from Avanade on the closer Never See Me Again, and the initially very low-key and atmospheric build-ups leading into an especially impressive sweeping emotional climax in Haunted Love. This album as a whole gives me similar vibes to certain productions from Machine Drum, and I could definitely get on board for that. So yeah, while I don't necessarily foresee this being like a long-term keeper, it's definitely one that I like more for specific moments than for the full unbroken experience. There's also definitely enough quality to be found on this project to make it worth hearing, so give it a shot if you missed it. I'm overall feeling a 7.5 out of 10 on it. Next up from µ-Ziq, 1979. Alright, it looks like Mike Paradinas has selected some more ambient works and put together a full companion album to add on to his solid 1977 album from 2 years ago, loosely inspired by traveling to the Spanish cities of Avila and Majadahonda, where his family hails from. Ultimately, I didn't have enough to say about the results where I felt compelled to make a full dedicated video on it, but I enjoyed my time with them all the same. The album is maybe a little on the samey side. There's plenty of tracks that focus on like pleasant pad chords like the somewhat stiff Galletas, the airy The Next Room, the glacier Yemas, or the fittingly brooding Majadahonda at Dusk. Tracks which focus on Paradinas' recognizable vocal synth tones with thicker pads and arpeggios to go alongside them, like on Billowy, Tente, and Homebush. The latter two sound like almost the exact same track. Although the opener, Majadahonda at Dawn, makes for a pretty mysterious and strikingly off-kilter highlight in the same vein. And tracks which focus on simple synth chord sequences like Clary 1 and 2 or Radox. Out of the tracks in the latter category, Clary 1 is the clear highlight for me for having the strongest melodies. But there are some other interesting turns as well, not just the dark clanging ambience of Pulsar, which leans away from the melodies altogether for some pretty neat effect, but also the handful of tracks that bring back in the dance beats like the stomping but also quite comforting and friendly tones of Flotation, the mildly triumphant melodic house banger of House 14, or the slow build of the closer Escorial, starting out with simple plinky synth sequences and getting more layered as it goes along, with dramatic synth string pads and sparse IDM percussion to go alongside it. Ultimately, this album definitely runs together for me and feels more like a side release to add on to an existing project. 1977 definitely felt like it was more of a main event type project that was markedly more interesting and investing for me, while this album, even though I know it was developed separately, feels like it could have just been leftovers from those sessions. Though still, this companion project has its moments scattered around that are quite strong for what they are, able to hit on their emotional notes quite effectively, and it does have that warm cinematic mood you can sink yourself into. All of this is quite enjoyable for what it's going for, and there aren't any tracks which feel like outright skips to me. So yeah, if Paradinas delivering some more buttery, smooth, melodic ambient sounds like it'd be your thing, then it'll be worth giving a shot. I'm overall feeling a 7.3 out of 10 on it. Next up, from µ-Ziq, Manzana. Alright, it looks like Paradinas has selected even more ambient works to put together another full companion album to add on to his companion album to add on to 1977. On brand as ever, I see. You know any given era of his has like 3 or more albums worth of material going into it, and most of the leftover strays will get a publicly released tome eventually. I do think I enjoyed Manzana more than 1979 though. While it isn't as consistent as that album, and there are a decent handful of tracks which don't really hit that well for me, looking at the somewhat dull, creepy synthplex of a track like Windy Day, the somewhat forgettable airy ambient pads of penultimate track Norbiton, or the interludes like the inessential ambient fragment Noche, and the off-puttingly unpleasant and garish mix of synth, bass, and MIDI cymbals on Plug, for instance. But putting aside moments like those, there were more hits than misses here. Best track here is either the opener track, called 1979, confusingly, easily the most well-layered and dense set of cinematic ambient pads on the album that feels really huge and enveloping and dramatic, or the track Elm, which builds from simple mid-range synth arpeggios in its initial moments into really picking up in its second half with some thick MIDI electric bass and wiry pads introduced that make the mix feel all the more epic and propulsive despite the lack of beats. Beyond that, there's more melodic ambient cuts that would have fit just as well on the 1979 album, like the deep and bassy but warm and fuzzy Plinth, or the smooth and mildly catchy melodic progressions going up next to a clattering percussion loop on the title track. That one's definitely one of my bigger favorites here. Also quite like the airy arpeggios of Peppermint Arrow, which feel like they really call back to the roots of that 90s ambient techno scene, and feel like they could be hitting on some Outeker Amber adjacent vibes. But in between those, you got a solid amount of dark ambient tracks that lean away from the melodies, or just make them markedly creepier and more foreboding. And they add some welcome variety, be it the open windiness and later drill-like leads of Citroën GSA, the Distant Storm interlude, which was a surprisingly striking mix of dissonant synth string pads and effects that lived up to its title, or the foreboding Coffee Arrow, making a thick but immersive mix of pads, reverb-soaked drum machines, and plenty of old-school acid progressions. And the album ends on a particularly strange but still oddly hopeful note with Martini, mostly built around a repeating sample of someone saying the title, absolutely soaked in reverb, but with lots of quirky, lighthearted melodies built around it. So yeah, as was the case with 1979, Manzana also very much feels like a companion album and not a main event. This album is also not as good as 1977, and there are definitely some skips here, but even if this album was a bit more of a mixed bag than 1979, I do feel like the experience was more interesting for me, and its best moments were better able to pull me in. I'm inclined to say I preferred this one slightly. If I were forced to put these albums in my ranking of all the main µ-Ziq studio albums, they would both admittedly be close to the bottom. In fact, I think Grush is better than 1979, which would put the latter at the bottom of said ranking. But I think Manzana is about on par with or slightly better than Skrillex, so there you go. Again, proof that the weakest main Paradinas album is still gonna be a good time. I won't call either of these new albums absolute must-listens, but they're both quite good for what they are and have really strong highlights worth recommending, and Manzana in particular gave me enough of substance where I'm willing to let it off with a 7.5 out of 10. Next up from Ninajirachi, I Love My Computer. Okay, I got a whole bunch of requests to talk about this one. Ninajirachi is a 25-year-old Australian EDM and hyperpop producer who's been really blowing up this year. One moment I had never heard of her, and another I see her getting, like, interviewed by Fantano, and that she's even opened up for Charlie XCX and Porter Robinson. He's really making some waves right now. Not gonna lie, when I saw this circulating around, I was skeptical it was actually going to appeal to me. People who followed this channel regularly enough know that I don't really cover hyperpop that often. It's one of those genres that I can respect, but often actively struggle to connect with on a deeper level. A lot of times it's either just too overbearing for my personal tastes, and or occasionally the irony-poisoned attitude behind some of it can rub me the wrong way. Also, in the very specific case of Charlie XCX, I have struggled since people hyped her up to such a, massive game-changing level, what she does has never been done before, and then I hear Brat, and it's just like a regular old good dance pop record that appealed to the regular pop music industry enough to win a Grammy. But whatever, I'm going on a tangent there. In the case of this album, some of my typical irony and attitude-related issues with certain stripes of this subgenre are here a little too. I hear a song like Fuck My Computer, where the artist expresses her desire to literally fuck her computer because no one in the world knows her better. Yeah, obviously that is an ironic self-deprecating joke not meant to be taken literally, but the way it's framed, whether consciously or subconsciously, could maybe come off to me like the whole thing's coming out of a place of insecurity about the genre she operates in being inherently uncool, or even like electronic music is the butt of a joke. I think I pretty much just had this reaction because it gave me war flashbacks to the days when I was in middle school, and when I told classmates I was into electronic music, they wrote it off as like that beep boop beep music made by machines. And now here's an album from an artist all but talking about how she makes that beep boop beep music made by machines, and I don't know how to take that. Though I seriously doubt that coming off that way to me was actually part of the intention in any way, and this really is not as intrusive an issue for me here as it was for more recent Porter Robinson. Unlike Porter, I don't feel like Ninajirachi has like a secret subconscious lack of passion for electronic music. The album as a whole does feel like it is coming out of a genuine place of love for this particular early 2010s electropop sound. Also, the presence of the track Sing Good, where she directly talks about how she made music in GarageBand because she enjoys making music despite not feeling like she's capable of singing or playing that good, and not getting the approval of her music teachers and stuff. I do relate to all of that a lot. That was quite handily my favorite track on this thing. And putting aside any comments on the lyrics or tone of the album, just taking for how it is musically, this is just a solid collection of hard-hitting electro-pop tunes that sound like they could have just been pulled out of like the late 2000s and early 2010s, with plenty of catchy melodies to go around. If you want something in a sort of similar vein to, say, Crystal Castles, with less chiptune influences and not completely ruined by horrifying abuse scandals, then this'll hit for you. I don't have a lot to break down about most of the tracks themselves outside of them being bangers, I guess. The tracks that tended to hit the most for me were just the ones with the brightest melodic hooks like iPod Touch, Delete, All I Am, or the more classic trance-influenced Info Hazard. Also, the closer All at Once makes for a pretty epic finish with a marginally larger scale and complex structure. Although the distance between my enjoyment of my favorite and least favorite tracks here isn't that pronounced, tracks like the stutter edit heavy London song, the future bass flavored Battery Death, and the grooving stomper Cyrac, featuring lots of chipmunk vocal chops that I didn't even realize were supposed to have actual lyrics for my first couple of listens, and I thought were just there for textural flair. All those tracks are cool too, and the fact that the entire album is structured in a seamless, continuous mix with all of the tracks specifically written to directly segue into each other certainly helps all of it hit even better. And that's pretty much all I have to say. While I don't foresee this album being the kind of thing I end up keeping around longer term, this is clearly the kind of thing that's going to have a lot more immediate appeal for certain audiences. So if all of this sounds like it'd be your thing and you somehow hadn't heard it yet, then give it a shot. And on a personal level, I think I can also give this a 7.3 out of 10. Next up from Grandbrothers, Elsewhere. Right, next up here's a more under-the-radar name. I was first made aware of this German modern classical and ambient electronic duo when they released their previous album Late Reflections in 2023. I covered that album in the Volume 12 roundup and thought it was legit great. The strikingly emotive piano melodies from pianist Errol Sarp and the inventive way those pianos were rhythmically processed by engineer Lucas Vogel was really cool and pulled me in both emotionally and sound design-wise. Even if I turned out not to come back to it as much as I thought I would and it missed the cut from my year-end list, it still held up really well upon a more recent revisit, so I stand by my feelings as expressed in that segment. I've also heard their other 3 previous albums since then. They're all kind of the exact same sort of thing, with ever so slightly less electronic textures. Their debut, Dilation, is really good and worth going back to. Their other 2 albums, Open and All the Unknown, were both equally as pretty, but kind of bounced off me as less varied explorations of the same kinds of sounds and ideas. Late Reflections is probably their best one to date. Anyway, with their last album experimenting with a bit more electronic textures, it only made sense that the duo were due for a bit of a change. And that takes us, well, elsewhere. All this duo's previous albums were nothing but piano, prepared piano, and digitally edited and processed piano, but this latest album shows them embracing more proper electronic stylings, bringing in full-on beatwork and synths in traditional house and garage adjacent frameworks to join the usual lush and emotive piano arrangements. While I'm all for the change of pace, and this seems like it appealed to me even more as the longtime lover of electronic classical crossovers that I am, really getting that Erased Tapes Records energy nailed down, I do also feel like the result is maybe like a transitional effort where the idea doesn't feel quite fully formed yet. The beats and synths, as mentioned, don't really diverge much from the kind of frameworks you'd already expect out of any number of house and garage records, but it also feels like they made their piano arrangements a bit more straightforward and impressionistic to make sure the beats and synths wouldn't be cutting into them. And while the resulting album that came out of this transition is just as predictably pretty and emotionally resonant as any of their other stuff, it does feel both less dynamic and less unique than some of their previous work. If I didn't know any better, I'd feel like they were making a play for pulling in a more mainstream adjacent audience, try for the modern Ninja Tune crowd or something. I don't think that's actually what they were trying to go for here. It's not that commercial, and their strengths with the piano melodies are still there. But it is an album that runs together for me a decent bit. It reminds me of the way I felt listening to the second Kiasmos album, although not running together quite that much. Unlike that album where every track may as well have been near identical, this album does have more clearly defined highlights and lowlights. The first half is probably a little stronger than the second half, as the run of the semi-burial-inspired Fable, bleeding into the bubblier synth arpeggios and house expanses of We Collide, into the more propulsive and energetic Where Else, and then into the more strikingly piano melodies of Liminal, going up against stabby, mildly rival consoles adjacent arrangements. They all almost kind of sound like they're bleeding together into the same track, but also the way they play ideas off each other is pretty neat and well-flowing. The second half is more hit and miss for me. A track like the somewhat interestingly off-kilter Rex Machina does more to act as like a dip in energy than anything all that attention-grabbing for me, and the closer Nowhere started with some cool dark ambient synths that briefly baited me into thinking we were going to be getting a bit of a darker, more experimental swerve at the end, but that didn't actually happen, and the rest of the track just ended up settling into the same kinds of melodic progressions heard elsewhere on the album. Although in between these cuts, we do get a couple of my biggest favorites here as well. Cypress had possibly the album's most dynamic and striking melodic compositions for me, and Run 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 lived up to its title and went for the album's most propulsive arrangement, bringing in some very light 80s synthwavey influences around the corners. So yeah, Elsewhere is still a solid album. I enjoyed it about the average level I've enjoyed Grandbrothers records in the past, but I wouldn't put it among their best. Late Reflections was a fair bit better, and I think I might have liked Dilation more too. Though I do think this is better than Open and All the Unknown for me, purely through its attempt to expand their palette and get out of their comfort zone. As this album is, there's not too much here that I wouldn't already be able to get out of any other standard Erased Tapes electronic classical crossover or Ben Lucas Boyson or whoever. But it is still really nice for what it is, and there might be potential here for something really special if they ever manage to combine the synths and beats and pianos in more dynamic and exciting ways going forward. This was still a pretty nice time. It's worth giving a shot if all that sounds like it'd be up your alley. I'll let this off with a 7.5 out of 10. Next up from Bitchin Bajas, Inland Sea. I guess while we're on the topic of following up on under-the-radar artists, we got a new one from fellow Chicago-based new age electronic trio, Bitchin Bajas. I really liked their last album from 2022 called Bahascilators, which I covered back in the Volume 10 roundup. Gave me a lot of really cool and well-textured and even sometimes decently hard-hitting improvisational cosmic mini-epics. And earlier this year, they also had an album with Natural Information Society, which, while not quite as memorable or investing for me, was still pretty solid for what it was. Have not gone back to hear their older work yet, may have to get on that some other time. Anyway, this latest album, Inland Sea, isn't quite as energetic as Bahascilators, but it is roughly equally as well textured, focusing more on getting to the melodic heart of their compositions and ending up with something roughly equally compelling as their last one, through hitting on a stronger emotional note. The album once again starts out really strong, albeit with a much more understated composition in Skylarking that has a lot of synth woodwinds floating through it, and this really light and fluffy and comforting melodic arrangement that was able to pull at the heartstrings pretty well. Getting some very mild air vibes out of the chord progression. And the way it pays off in the much shorter and tightly structured piano-driven melodies of Reno is really nice too. The two almost feel like two parts of the same whole, and both tracks are accompanied by some cool saxophone performances as well. KG Dreams goes for an entirely ambient approach and just flows through spacey synths and pads with no further accompaniment. Still nice, albeit not as investing as the surrounding moments. And finally, the album culminates in the 18.5-minute Grout, which starts out in pure ambience but builds up more of a foot-tapping groove than any other track here, with a bright and cheerful mix of layered synths that feels very heavily inspired by Kraftwerk's Autobahn and Ralph and Florian eras, when those guys were really embracing the synths and melodies for the first time, but were still sticking to their more open-ended krautrock jam roots on a structural level. Not every moment on this album is as investing as the next, and that was also true of Bajas later, but they hit roughly equally as well, and this one might even be a tiny bit better, at least more consistent where their last one had higher high points. And if I were to just take my favorite cuts from both albums, say if I were to cut KG Dreams out of this album and bring in Amorpha and Quackenbrook from their last one instead, that could possibly end up as like a proper home run of an album for me. As we stand though, Inland Sea is, at the end of the day, a very good album, and I can definitely recommend hearing this in its current form anyway. Got some really nice, comfy, cosmic 70s synth vibes out of this. That definitely makes it worth checking out, and I'm overall feeling a 7.7 out of 10 on it. Next up from Wagon Christ, Planet Roll. Shit, this one completely caught me off guard. It's time for the return of none other than Luke Vibert, who hadn't actually gone anywhere. He's been putting out plenty of enjoyable work in his usual acid banger molds over the past several years. But this is his first album under the Wagon Christ alias in a little while, since 2020 to be exact, with the album Recepticon, that I generally remember liking but don't really remember that much about it, besides it was another round of acid and rave bangers in the same style as the stuff he's released under his real name. I wasn't going to say I was going into Planet Roll with soaring expectations. I figured we were just gonna get some more solid acid bangers again. But actually, this turned out to be easily the most exciting, playful, imaginative, and well-varied release we've gotten from Vibert in years, combining instrumental hip-hop and trip-hop styles and zany out-of-the-box sample mashups with little hints of acid and house and breakbeats and the like, and fully recapturing the same kind of energy as my personal favorite Wagon Christ album, Tally-Ho. Every track continually grabbing your attention, not just with the consistently strong underlying grooves and creative assembly of sounds, but also with constant samples from rappers and rhythmic snippets from TV and movie dialogue, vaguely relating to each track's title, and forming lots of mildly strange and off-kilter but always catchy and memorable hooks. This album is legit great, and I did not see it coming at all. When the album got started and started hitting me with such imaginative instrumental hip-hop bangers like the woodwind-backed opener Snatch, the melancholic sample chops and punchy shouts on Get It, the even more punchy horn sections on Boy Zero, and then a track built around some of the synth riffs from Orbital's Spare Parts Express with a lot of funky disco beats built on top in Bitch Original Ruler. I was absolutely loving my time with this, and it kept hitting me with banger after banger. The mild 80s electro flavor of Can't Stop Don't Stop, the drum and bass flavored This, the sleeker house grooves of, well, Hausen, the more traditional acid banger of, well, Acid, both complete with lots of samples of people talking about acid and house. Also the somewhat more offbeat grooves provided by cuts like Boom Bip and Sydney Groovy. The somewhat more down-tempo quirkiness provided by I'm Sorry, or the borderline clown show-like disco of Super Groovy, which almost sounds like an act like Plone could have made. Now, I'd be lying if I said every cut on here grabbed me equally, and the album definitely runs out of steam in its very ending stretch, with tracks like Unsure with its off-key guitar loops, Style with its raga-influenced edges, and Seinfeldy slap bass, and finally the kind of floaty and dreamlike closer Wake Up. All nice tracks that keep up the quirky creativity, but at some point I do feel like the energy level is starting to trail off a bit and not retaining my attention as well. Doesn't end quite as strong as it starts. But still, I was not expecting to have as much consistent fun with this album as I ended up having, and the hits greatly outweigh the misses. This is definitely one of my favorite things Luke Vibert's released in a minute. You'll definitely want to check this one out if you missed it. I'm overall feeling an 8.3 out of 10 on it. Next up from Thorjn, Through the Crystal Window. Alright, got a new album from Thorjn. This artist definitely impressed me last year when they put out their debut album Full Body Sprain, which was an especially dense mix of ambience and glitch sitting pretty closely along the lines of his label mates on upscale, such as Hudson Lee and Alexander Panos. Didn't really have much in the way of regular beat work, but hit you with lots of colorful melodies and crazy effects and stuff. Off the promise of that album, I was interested in seeing where they take their sound next. I feel like this follow-up album is even more ambient-centric than the last one. The whole thing feels very clearly inspired by Oneotrix Point Never, with a lot of similar glassy synth textures and very mild 80s undertones here and there. Not as abstract and out there as something like R+7, but not as accessible or catchy as Magic Oneotrix Point Never. Kinda somewhere in between there. So really it's along the same lines as that brand new album that OPN literally just came out with. Which, boy, was that unlucky timing. For the record, I don't think this is better than Tranquilizer. That album felt like it had more of substance to it and paced itself better. But like I said when I shouted this out in my Tranquilizer review, I feel like if you like one, you'll like the other. Now, setting that comparison aside and instead comparing this to my experience with this artist's previous work, I do admittedly have a lot of the exact same observations to make on this album that I did on Full Body Sprain. Once again, trying for, like, big, impressive atmospherics without really adhering to a regular groove for the most part. Sounding really cool and immersive in the moment, if once again running together a bit without me being able to tell many tracks apart from each other. I think there was even less beat work on this album than there was on his debut, and there's more parts that just seem to meander wherever, such as the near 9-minute centerpiece Avoket going up and down in energy level without really any structure or rhyme or reason to its various progressions. There were a number of tracks that included vocals this time around, such as the title track or the closer The Arcside Pacific, although said vocals definitely feel like they're added more for texture and feel like they're just acting more as synths to add on to their surrounding blends. Though the tracks that ended up being bigger highlights for me on average were the somewhat higher energy ones and the ones that attempted to give their mixes more of an actual pulse, like the massive synth chords of Butterfly Suntrails that feel like they could be forming a beat out of like Windows 98 computer startup style synth washes. Also the glittering and almost shoegazy Chrysalis, which is the one moment where the vocals are actually trying to carry the core tune instead of acting as background textures. There's the bouncing cascades of synth melodies on Vanilla Corridor. There's the track Under Angel, which kinda hits a note in between the former two tracks. Or my personal favorite track, Ohm Field, which gets more propulsive and energetic than any other track on this album. Technically no beats, but the way the synth cores and massive pads get chopped up along a regular grid forms something of a groove anyway. That was really exciting, as was the bonus track Infinity Cave, which hit a similar note and I think made for a stronger and more climactic ending than the Arcside Pacific did. So yeah, this album's pretty dang cool. Oh, by the way, also shout out to the companion EP he just released called Novo Pangea. If you want to hear some material that gets even more formless, abstract, experimental, and out there, kind of delving more into like drone and abstract noise territory, loosely themed around the ills of our modern tech billionaire-centered society, that'll be a good time too. But as for Through the Crystal Window, I do think I preferred Full Body Sprain a bit over this album as it had a slight bit more energy to it on average and didn't fall quite as much in the shadow of its influences. This isn't necessarily the kind of thing I see myself keeping around longer term, but the melodies and sound design are just as impressive as they were on the debut, while also kind of having their own flavor separate from that album. I've already seen this album really hit on a deeper emotional level for certain people and like really transport them to some surreal alternate universe. And even if there are other albums in this vein that are even more effective at doing that for me, I can definitely see exactly where those people are coming from with how spacious and full sounding and well polished, and how imposingly huge and dense sounding every single mix is. If you told me this came from OPN himself, I would not have questioned it. So, I guess take that all as you will. This is a very cool album, gonna be properly mind-blowing for certain people, worth giving a shot. I'm overall feeling a 7.5 out of 10 on it. Next up from Nightmares on Wax, Echo 45 Sound System.
Yeah. Here come the number one sound dedicated to all crew dedicated.
Alright, this is a comeback I've low-key been rooting for. Long-running trip-hop and instrumental hip-hop producer George Evelyn, aka DJ Ease, aka Nightmares on Wax, has made some of my favorite albums of all time, such as Smoker's Delight and Feeling Good. And back in my college days used to be one of my most frequent go-to artists whenever I needed something to ease my anxiety, no pun intended. Although we are coming out of something of a low period for him that had me really questioning how much of a fan I could really call myself. His last album, Shout Out to Freedom, was easily his weakest project to date by some distance, mostly for having his driest and least sonically interesting batch of tracks, but also even further tonally soured by having come out of a period when, on his social media, he was getting like knee-deep in anti-vax conspiracies. To be fair, that only really kinda seeped into the lyrics of one track on that album, and to his credit, the guy did back down from his worst takes and got back to purely promoting good vibes, which is not easy to do on Twitter. But there was still that air of wrongness around the whole project that I couldn't shake, and the music just wasn't good enough to distract from it. Also made the attempts at social commentary on his album before that, Shape the Future, hit even more of a questionable note in retrospect. See my recent video on 10 more albums I changed my mind on for more details on that. Still, it did seem like the guy wanted to get back on track, so while I had my reservations going into this latest project, I at least made sure to give it a chance, and I had my fingers crossed that he could make a respectable bounce back. And you know what, I think a respectable bounce back is in fact what I got here with Echo 45 sound system. Now, this project is technically advertised as a mixtape, meant as a tribute to the old speaker box he purchased when he was young and nicknamed Echo 45, which first really got him into the music scene. Also to the pirate radio stations he grew up listening to at the same time. Although setting aside that specific inspiration, this otherwise sticks to exactly what I'd expect to hear out of any regular new Nightmares on Wax album, and may as well just be treated as a regular album anyway. And while I'm not going to tell you that the resulting experience is like among his very best work or anything, it's a solidly consistent return to form that made for a good reminder of why I actually became as much of a fan of his as I used to be back when I was in college. If there is anything that sets this project apart from the usual Nightmares on Wax fare, aside from the loose pirate radio concept, this album does focus more on, like, dub and reggae influences than usual. There are some regular old dub reggae cuts here, like the sort of title track Echo 45, or the closer Hop to Mystic, both with Liam Bailey, that just play that genre completely straight and deliver the kind of good vibes you might want to hear out of that. But most of the rest of this is the kind of silky smooth trip-hop sound he's typically known for. Other highlights include the dusty, organ-driven opener Dive Into with Louis VI, the playful and upbeat lead single Bang Bien with Yasin Bey, the interestingly off-kilter and funky grooving loops of True with Sadie Walker, and pretty much any tracks built around old-school string and piano samples for that extra emotional hit seen on the dramatic and dubby Holding On with Lady Six, or the moody piano-driven penultimate cut Wind to Change with Yara Bravo, and my personal favorite cut in the bunch, Desire with Hyla Supreme and Liam Bailey, which has easily the smoothest and warmest of all the beats on here. Also shout out to the track I Remember with Green Tea Pang. I was half dreading this cut given Green Tea Pang was the vocalist for the track with that fucking fact check the fact checkers line on his last album. But this time around she just sticks to talking about the music of her own childhood, and it goes over much better. Refreshingly unproblematic. Now, the album does sag a bit in its second half, with tracks like Starward Bound or µ-Ziq that don't really grab my attention, and I don't know if I'd put any of the best tracks on here among the very best Nightmares on Wax tracks ever, but there's not a super pronounced distance between the best and worst tracks here, or cuts that instill any urge for me to hit the skip button either, which is nothing to sniff at coming from him. It is one of his more consistent efforts overall. So yeah, that's about all I have on Echo 45 sound system. All around a pleasant surprise and good to have him back on track doing his thing. Worth giving a shot if you've enjoyed his stuff in the past. I'm overall feeling a 7.7 out of 10 on this. Next up from Sket, InitiatriX. Okay, next we got a pretty interesting effort from this 26-year-old UK producer releasing his debut album on Planet Mu. This doesn't sit that far away from the kind of territory that his label mate Slickback explored with his Attrition album earlier this year, mostly a UK-based record with influences from grime and other experimental flavors, as well as extremely huge-sounding and pummeling bass-heavy sound design, though unlike Slickback, who mostly tried his hardest to still make visceral bangers out of his experimental bass music influences, Sket leans harder on the experimental side, delivering much more formless blends of crazy percussion blends and chopped-up vocal snippets that very very occasionally come in the shape of a bass or grind banger, as on the functional opener Vendetta's theme, but even more often just go completely unhinged with their structure and sound like everything's trying to be the soundtrack to some insane Lynchian horror film, and throw all sorts of messed up imagery in your face, with every single melody that might be present being so extremely dissonant that they may as well not have melodies at all. And there's loads of different sounds being thrown at you. You get creepy string sections and foreboding dark ambient pads on tracks like Futaro or Permanent Kigurumi, warped pianos on Audition for the Part of the Killer, fucked up sound effects of squelching and screaming and borderline harsh noise on the closer Locked In, warped violins and gurgling bass on Dysentery, which sonically lives up to its title, random manipulated vocal fragments or almost text-to-speech sounding spoken words bits on tracks like Supermodel Mansion or InitiatriX, and plenty more. Now, I will admit the near lack of structure in this album did lead it to fall into the background for me more often than not. As nasty and fucked up as everything sounds, it's not a blend of nastiness so out there as to be unlike anything I've ever experienced before. But you know, there were a couple of moments that did grab me as particular highlights. I already mentioned Vendetta's theme as having the most of a traditional trap beat and just being an off-the-wall experimental bass banger, but I also quite liked the more complex abstractions of tracks like Casting Call and Desire for Stealth, which packed the greatest amount of different sounds into their running time, with the former going a little Venetian snaresy, combining more dissonant violins with a few little break beats in a structure that sorta resembles drum and bass, and the latter being a multi-phase, sorta ambient cut that just flows through everything from creepy organs to distorted screams to glitchy percussion workouts to whatever else. But there was one track here that stood apart as my favorite by some distance, the track µ-Ziq, chopped up its blend of sound effects in such a particular way that came off surprisingly catchy. There's not that strong a tune unless you count the dramatic movie soundtrack strings in certain parts, but there's still a hook formed out of those chopped up thumping sounds, and it both feels foreboding and weird, but also interestingly accessible. So that was really cool. And yeah, that's about all I got on this album. Probably not the kind of thing I'm going to personally keep around longer term, but I can't fault it for just how out there it tries to go, the kind of thing that will be properly mind-blowing for certain other audiences, and the sound design and production is legit impressive. Guy fits right at home on the Planet Me roster for sure, so take that all as you will. This was some solid stuff. I'm overall feeling a 7.5 out of 10 on it. Next up from Dominik Eulberg, Lepidoptera. Right, you know, I was looking forward to this one. Dominik Eulberg has proven himself to be a pretty consistently interesting and evocative producer who combines fairly standard if driving and well-crafted techno grooves with occasional more organic textures and light and fluffy melodic flares and plenty of nature-inspired imagery, making albums about flora and fauna, natural wonders, and bird plumage and stuff. His 2011 album Diorama really stuck with me as his best, but he's had plenty of solid stuff over the years I've enjoyed. If you want more details, you can hear my thoughts on his previous album Avicrom, which I covered back in the Volume 9 roundup and did the mini and brief segment. This latest album, which is obviously themed after butterflies and names each track after a species of butterfly in German, delivers all the usual sounds and formulas you'd expect, lots more expansive techno and downtempo arrangements with heartfelt melodies. Chances are if you've really loved his stuff before, you'll probably be into this as well. But I do have to say, I felt like this particular round of material from him left a little something to be desired, maybe. Perhaps I just put it on while in the wrong mood or something, but I felt like this album really dragged, and while half the track listing was able to click with me, the other half felt too plain and run-of-the-mill and just lost my attention. While I was sitting with tracks like Browner Bear and Grünes Blatt with their very rudimentary techno structures and forgettable melodies, I felt myself tuning out. And tracks like Roter Apollo, Schwalbenschwanz, and Trauermantel felt like less interesting iterations of ideas he's already done better before, and in the case of the former, just kinda hit a weirdly oily and unpleasant note. The stretch of this album in the middle first half briefly had me considering not covering this at all, though the album did also have its share of standouts that successfully got me to reconsider. The best track on here by a significant margin is Stachel Bearspanner. The way those orchestral synth pads went up against those super smooth Audiker Yolquen style synth riffs was really nice, and it created this sense of mysterious spaciousness I really got myself immersed in. And beyond that, there were a handful of other standouts sprinkled throughout. Mittlerer Weinschwärmer took a while to really get going, but the way it steadily progressed from standard techno beats into bordering on shoegaze at the very end with all its distorted clouds of melodic noise was pretty epic. I did particularly like the rounder and spacier synth textures that ran through the mildly off-kilter grooves of penultimate cut Totenkopfschwärmer. And I suppose the bright music box chimes and synth woodwinds on closer Tagfauenauge left the album on a nice, if somewhat cloying note. Oh yeah, and I did think the very beginning of the album was pretty good too. The light IDM tapping and ambient orchestral pads of opener Kleines Nachtfauenauge were decently evocative, and the more energetic and jittery synth riffs of second track Grosser Schillerfalter were pretty fun too. So yeah, a bit of a mixed bag with this album to say the least. It definitely has its moments. The highest points here really did wrap me up in what they were doing, but I was also really feeling that 70-minute length by the end. I can respect Eulberg's instinct to just kinda let loose and have fun with making this stuff, but it doesn't feel like he was giving that much thought to the pacing in the process. And the result is an album that, while decent overall, is not among his best work. He's made other albums that hit a lot of similar notes to this one and do it even better, so I guess take that all as you will. I don't think he'll be losing any fans over this, but I don't think he'll be gaining any new ones with this either, so yeah, I'm personally overall feeling a 6.5 out of 10 on this. Next up from Miffle, Goodbye World. Wow, I can't even remember the last time that I found out about an underground artist in my usual wheelhouse through their being covered by Anthony Fantano of all people. Let alone that artist turning out to be the kind of random obscure Bandcamp rec that I usually stuff these roundups with, but hey, I'll take it. I thought this album was pretty dang solid for what it was. This is something of an uncommon crossover between musique concrète, experimental noise, ambient, and instrumental folk music. Not the first time I've heard a crossover between folk, noise, and ambient. Stuff like Daniel Bachman's Almanac Behind, or Katja Crow's I've Called Off the Search, I Know Exactly Where You Are come to mind. But I do think the particular execution and blend of these sounds as heard on this album is unique enough for this artist to call their own. The mix of acoustic guitars with glitch effects and tape manipulation and the like is quite lo-fi and heartfelt, but does a good job of capturing your attention through the full running time, be it on tracks that focus more on the guitars like The Invisible Girl, or certain parts of Static Snow, which itself goes through a couple of evolutions, tracks that focus more on the glitchy details and effects like Remnants of a Dream or Peeking Through Light Ambience on Cold Concrete Glows in the Moonlight, or on tracks that get more noisy and drone-heavy like Digital Blizzard or the album's penultimate 7-minute climax, Long Walk Home You Exist in My Frozen Memories Forever, which builds into harsh walls of distorted noise for about half its running time. The album's very beginning and ending with The City is Calm at This Hour and the title track is also pretty haunting, as well as the guitars get a little squeaky and high-pitched, and the mixes feel like they're barely being held together at the seams. The whole album does come together to hit a pretty nice emotional note, being a loose tribute to the artist's friend who passed away. Now, I will admit, having heard lots of drone and experimental records kind of in a semi-adjacent vein to this, there are other projects I've heard over the years that have gotten to me on a deeper emotional level than this, or wowed me even more, like those two comparison points I made earlier. I'm not sure whether this will be the kind of thing I end up keeping around longer term, but I don't really have anything to complain about here either. It sounds unique, it hits on all the nostalgic emotions it's going for. If you don't trust Fantano's take for any number of reasons, I can also co-sign this is very good and worth checking out. And I'm overall feeling a 7.7 out of 10 on it. Next up from Rural Tapes, Oneirik. So while we're on the topic of under-the-radar Bandcamp finds crossing lines between electronic and folk and other things, here crossed with alternative indie pop and psychedelic styles rather than musique concrète or experimental drone, here's an album from Norwegian producer and multi-instrumentalist Rural Tapes, which I happened to come across from a Bandcamp Daily Rec one day. Perhaps somewhat on the boundaries of my format, since several tracks are played with a full band with guitars and drums and stuff, and even one track featuring the vocals of Alexis Taylor of Hot Chip fame. But this whole thing is on like the Stereolab parts of my format boundary where I feel like it is close enough to count. The second I put this album on for the first time and got treated to the absolutely astonishing blend of wobbly and wavy synth effects, all sorts of guitar textures from fuzzed out noise guitars to processed wah-wah guitars and whatever else, funky Air Moon Safari style bass lines, mellotrons and vibraphones, all coming together on the album's opener, Flower Lab. I was completely caught off guard by it in the best possible way. This track is the best cut on the album by a significant margin, lives up to all the vibes promised by the album cover, and feels like it is ascending me into a new dimension of nostalgia, as it were. The rest of the album might not live up to the immediately exciting height of that one track, but there is still other really nice stuff able to hit on comparably satisfying mixes, such as the post-rocky ballad Hyperamnesia, which combines slow jazzy drumming with moody guitars and synths and some sampled running commentary from some kind of news announcer in another language. Norwegian, maybe. That one's able to hit on some solid emotional notes, and Bird's Eye View brings back those air-style bass lines and well-layered, spacey synth arrangements for another really dang satisfying mix. The album does feel like it gets progressively more and more saccharine and sweet as the album goes along. When we get to the somewhat overly cheery and simplistic C major tune of Fantasia, I'm still on board, mainly thanks to its inclusions of vocoder vocals. And the way it plays off the ambient interlude Reverie with its moody vibraphone chords was really nice too. Though the melodies only get more and more overly cheery and major key, peaking in sweetness with closer Lucid Dreaming, which feels like a credit roll for the album made out of simple mellotron melodies and an old school 70s drum machine beat. By that point it's melodically major key enough to feel maybe a little cliche, and like it's overdoing things a tad. And I will say the two vocal tracks on this album, they were both nice enough, but neither were major highlights for me. Lingering Souls with Gary Olson is a fun enough 60s pop throwback that once again gets a little saccharine with its melody, and the lyrics which directly mention flowers. And the track with Alexis Taylor, Retire the Fool, almost feels like an ambient interstitial moments than a core track as he sings over a simple stripped back piano instrumental with lots of dub echoing. And speaking of ambient interstitial moments, there's a ton of interludes on this album, like an ambient album intro NREM, which is field recordings and simple synth lines, a lo-fi solo piano recording called Eidetic Memory, a quick 37-second snippet of muted synth and drum machines called Wool Gathering, and a 20-second bit of synth effects called Dream Within a Dream. These cuts all exist, I guess. Reverie was the only one that hit enough for me to be a highlight in its own right. Can't fault the album for trying to make its structuring interesting or get more eclectic, I suppose. Also can't fault the album for sheer tightness at just 35 minutes total. I don't foresee this album being a long-term keeper in full, since it's definitely the kind of thing where some moments just hit like light years better than others, and the experience is pretty front-loaded. But I can't deny the heights those high points can hit, and the weirder quirks of this album and the way it was put together, I suppose, did make it more interesting and make me want to talk about it more. At the end of the day, it's a good album, worth checking out if that sounds like it'd be your thing. I'm overall feeling a 7.5 out of 10 on it. Next up from Max Cooper and Rob Clouth, 8 Billion Realities EP. Okay, here we go. Second day of recording. This was a crossover I absolutely had to hear the second I heard it was a thing. Two more modern techno and IDM legends coming together. Max Cooper, the guy who runs the Mesh label, who I saw live earlier this year, and who a few months ago put out one of my favorite albums of this year in On Being. And Rob Clouth, the guy whose work first got me to follow the Mesh label in the first place way back in 2020 thanks to his 0 Point album. Sure, this was just an EP, but I figured it would have to at least be interesting. And, well, it kind of was, but not for any of the reasons I expected it to be. The two tracks that focus more on the kinds of sounds that you would expect from these two artists honestly weren't as much to write home about as I thought they would be. I saw the 7-minute opener Asymptote and got really hyped, but the more times I listened back to it, the more it just kind of bounced off me as a kind of simplistic minimal techno cut that plays to the least interesting aspects of both artists' sounds. I guess it's got some neat evolution over time, but it's nowhere near either of their best work in my opinion. And the other cut in a similar vein, Candelada, at least had some more grit and texture with more crazy glitches and details. It'll probably go down great live, but also kinda went in one ear and out the other more listens than not. Though the other two cuts, which don't stick as much to exactly the sounds you'd expect, were much bigger highlights in my opinion. Most notably, I got completely taken off guard by the EP's title track, which was actually a hip-hop banger of all things. The two guys creating this glitchy and off-kilter banging beat with 2000s tipper-style new school breaks and DJ scratches for guest rapper Flohio to spit some rhymes over. That one hard as fuck. Easily the biggest highlight of the EP for me. And the closer, A Moment Set Aside, was quite nice as well. It's entirely ambient and made out of nothing but synth arpeggios, but they do build up quite nicely and reach a pretty epic emotional climax. So, yeah, while the EP as a whole might have left me wishing for a bit more than what I got and isn't exactly the best work either artist is capable of, I guess I still had enough of an enjoyable time with it to let it off with a very light, solid 7 out of 10. Next up from Neuro, No Neuro, Card Catalog. Alright, next random Bandcamp find comes from this microsound, IDM, ambient, and kawaii glitch artist from Tucson, Arizona. I think I first came across this artist earlier this year when I believe Patricia Texan made like a one-off Tumblr post back before her page got nuked, shouting out this guy's 2023 album Positive. I listened to it and I thought it was really nice. This guy has a knack for putting together mixes which on the surface are super low-key and unassuming, but have absolute tons of tiny little details of all sorts of neat shapes and sizes to pay attention to. I briefly considered covering that album in a roundup this year since it seemed like the kind of thing that could use more attention than it was getting, though later I actually looked a little more into his output and realized he's put out like 7 different releases this year alone, mostly EPs, but one of them was a new album which he put out this past February, and I enjoyed it on a roughly equal level for the exact same reasons that I enjoyed Positive, so I swapped it out and put it here instead. Yeah, a lot of really low-key but really satisfying microsound and IDM mixes to be heard here, lots of plinky little synth bells of varying pitches, airy ambient pads, and light tapping percussion that match the sort of minimal but colorful aesthetic the album cover promises. The initial stretch might be maybe a tiny bit samey, with a track like Small Walking Pebbles just feeling like a sparser version of the opener, and Soft Hand Touching feeling like kind of the same thing but a change to a different key maybe. But they're still all pretty neat. And then there's a bit more variation in the shapes and display, like how Limited Patience gets a bit brighter and more video game-like with its synth plucks, and hard cuts and chops up some of its ambient pads around. Corners to Curves borders on just kind of being ASMR in some moments with its extremely quiet percussion taps, and the album gets a bit more tender and emotional as it goes along, starting out with the warmer pads joining in the mix on You Chose This. The mix on Redbirds and Bluebirds starts to get a bit thicker and possibly more cinematic with its melodies doing more traditional harmonizing with the pads. And then it finishes with Portions that mostly has echoing synth chords going over light wind chimes. There may not be much to this album and it's only about a half hour in total, but it feels sufficiently fleshed out and does a good job of getting you to pay attention with all the different textures and patterns on display here, despite how minimalistic they are. Stuff like this is definitely up my alley, and if it sounds like it'd be up your alley as well, then I can definitely recommend giving this a shot. I'm overall feeling a 7.7 out of 10 on it. Next up from Daniel Avery, Tremor. I've started to get the feeling that I may have gotten off on the wrong foot with Daniel Avery. I have covered this UK ambient techno artist a couple of times in the past in previous roundups, 3 previous times to be exact, and nearly any time I did give him a shot I found myself feeling more on the lukewarm side than most people seem to be, if not sometimes just outright dismissive of what I was hearing. I'd always seen a lot of hype around him, and his stuff always felt like the kind of thing that should appeal to my tastes pretty directly, but by my ears there wasn't really anything that he was doing that loads of other ambient techno artists from the 90s hadn't already done better, nor did it feel like he was bringing that unique a personality to that sound. Though now electronic music in the 2020s has gone so full swing into so many more retro 90s dance throwbacks, and the particular market that Avery was aiming at is so much more crowded, and yet he still gets talked about just as fondly to this day and continues to rack up just as much, if not even more, acclaim. Earlier this year when I was at the Max Cooper concert, I talked to a guy who told me that Daniel Avery was literally his favorite artist of all time. I mean, have I just been missing something, or what? Truth be told, I'd been spending a lot of time on this segment and briefly considered making it a video on its own as a means of refamiliarizing myself with his back catalog and see if he really does have more of a leg up now that everyone else is doing throwbacks, maybe even do an in brief segment. And I don't think my publicly expressed standpoints have changed quite enough to merit that, at least from a standpoint of, you know, the way I've worded myself. But I am starting to see more of the vision for what he does and what people see in his work. Putting his debut Drone Logic aside, which, despite still probably being his best album, I think may have inadvertently set people's expectations for the kind of artist he is in the wrong place. When it comes to his core style of ambient techno heard on any of his other albums, I cannot deny that he does have a knack for atmosphere building and really nailing down that kind of lonely, isolated, and melancholic but retro-futuristic feel that the old 90s artificial intelligence albums have. Albums like Song for Alpha and Love Plus Light do really hit on that feeling of quiet alienation quite well, and the latter of those albums grew on me a lot on Return Visit in particular. I was probably a bit too harsh on Together and Static as well, even if I stand by that being his weakest album and there not really being any thought put into the structuring. The good moments on there did still hold up better than I remembered. Also, as time has gone on, he's tried to do more to highlight other influences of his, such as shoegaze and industrial music, that were always there, but may have only been informing choices in melody and texture in a very subtle way early on, and only became more obvious on albums like Ultra Truth, or of course that entire project he did with Alessandro Cortini. Though I guess if albums like those didn't convince you that 80s New Wave, Gary Newman, and Nine Inch Nails weren't just as informative to his style as the Aphex Twins of the world, he certainly made it so that absolutely no one would be able to ignore those influences any longer on this latest album, Tremor, which ditches nearly all the ambient techno influences he's cut his teeth on for the past near decade, in favor of an electronic rock record that sounds like a cross between NIN and Seafeel, all industrial and shoegaze with a little bit of synth pop in there as well through the inclusions of a whole bunch of guest vocalists. It's a massive swerve that sounds almost nothing like anything he's ever made before, although one that does make logical sense for him to have made if you've really read between the lines on other older albums of his. Now, I can obviously always respect an artist making a change of pace this massive and keeping things interesting, but do I actually enjoy it? It's true that I have gone on record as not always being the biggest NIN fan or 80s fan, and that the ambient techno sound that's Avery's usual bread and butter tends to mean more to me, so it would ordinarily stand to reason that this would appeal less to me than his other stuff, but honestly I ended up getting into all of it for what it was. I'm not gonna say I absolutely loved it, it's not a deep album exactly and didn't reveal new sides of itself to me with repeat listens. But the heavier moments banged without feeling like they were getting too overbearing for me, the melodies and hooks and vocal performances were all really solid, and I think hearing this album was part of what got the rest of his catalog to start clicking with me more. Seeing these influences have low-key kind of been here the whole time allowed me to see more of Avery's personality as a producer beyond shallow retreads of an old aesthetic I liked. It does really lull you into a false sense of security with the very opening, the album starting with the ambience of Neon Pulse and the mildly 80s flavored reverb-heavy synth pop ballad Rapture in Blue with Cecile Believe, make you think that this album is going to be like a poppier version of what he did on Ultra Truth. Only for you to be hit with the heavy industrial guitars, drums, and bass on Haze, and a composition that totally does that NIN thing of like hard cutting between super loud walls of noise and near silent ambience filtered through Avery's usual spacious and clean production style, and some pretty solid vocal performances from Ellie that allowed the composition to have more of a melody to anchor itself. And Haze ends up almost feeling like the real opener and most indicative look of what this album's about. Much of the rest of the album focuses on similar mixes as that, including A Silent Shadow carrying directly off that track's groove with a more spare and eerie drum machine beat, eventually building into an explosive climax at the end. Elsewhere taken to even more abrasive and oddly more catchy territory on Greasing Off the Racing Line, or the especially dark and industrial tinged but still atmospheric Disturb Me. And the shoegaze and 80s new wave elements really come in a lot in other parts, like The Ghost of Her Smile or In Keeping Soon Will Be Dust, which are a lot more tender and emotional in their melodies, but make sure to blast you with just as much distorted noise and walls of processed guitar. Although Avery does still make sure to give you a break every now and then, not just through more ambient-centric interludes like Until the Moon Starts Shaking, but also through tracks like New Life, which break up the sound a bit, in that case with some more epic atmospheric breakbeat material that once again would have fit right at home on his last album. If nothing else, the album is worth it for the closer I Feel You with Art School Girlfriend. Easily the best tune, and the way all the pads and vocals layer on top of each other so thickly reminded me of the best parts of Seafeel's Keek again, in the best possible way. Really strong emotional hitter to go out on. So yeah, that's about all I have to say on the topic of Tremor. This album isn't going to be a year-end list contender or anything. Again, I kinda got all I needed to get out of it on first listen, and it didn't reveal any other hidden depths that I think are gonna pull me back in repeatedly. But I did come out of it with a lot more respect for Daniel Avery than I used to have. Not just in the sense that it shows that he does have more range beyond the cliches of the genre he operates in and that he's willing to take such a big risk with such a drastic change in sound, but also helping recontextualize the emotions that have underscored most of his other work and make it clearer to me what he in particular can bring to that ambient techno sound beyond the shallow 90s nostalgia. It didn't suddenly make me love all his old albums. Again, most of what I said in previous segments still stand. And I don't even necessarily think this is one of his best albums ever either, but he has given me more of a reason to want to come back to his stuff going forward, and I will definitely take that. I think this album's really solid. I'm overall feeling a 7.5 out of 10 on it. Next up from Yaz Lancaster, After. Next up, here's one of the more interesting Bandcamp daily finds I've come across lately. This New York-based, self-described black transdisciplinary artist has put out what I can only describe as an experimental album exploring the feelings one has the moment in between sleeping and first waking up in the morning, while memories of your dreams are still sorta lingering but quickly fading away. The primary flavor of this album, I suppose, is ambient drone adjacent to a Tim Hecker sort of lane, though that barely sums it up since nearly every track on this thing sounds entirely different. Lancaster plays violin, electric guitar, drone jar, and provides their own vocals, with a number of other guest performers also contributing electronics and synths and/or vocals, among other things. There are more drone tracks on this album than tracks of other types. Tracks like Corporeal, Post No Bills, and IDKU build thick and heavy experimental ambience with vocals sort of floating through the ether, the latter building a pretty nice hook out of its repeating vocal lines and eventually culminating in Lancaster screaming said hook while their voices subtly drowned in background noise. Other tracks like Limerence, Last Weekend With You, or Closure float through other thick and often distorted but mildly relaxing drones of noise and build up very subtle grooves or melodies underneath that perhaps add in some vaporwave-esque flavors and have plenty of interesting evolutions over their lengthier running times. But as many tracks are just impressionistic drones, there's also just as many tracks which break away from that sound altogether. A track like When I Enter a Room I Look to You focuses entirely on Lancaster's violin performances layered on top of each other, hitting on some pretty nice emotional effects, while the opener Phosphenes glitches up and edits said violins into oblivion. Meanwhile, a track like Stillage goes for a low-key and tender duet between ambient synth and guitar that almost feels a little Boards of Canada inspired in moments. And then also out of nowhere, there's one random hip-hop track called Signs, where guest rapper C the Lieutenant flows over some jazzy electric pianos and organic percussion while Lancaster delivers their own airy trip-hop-esque vocals for another easily accessible hook. And in between all these tracks are a set of experimental interludes, each called Dream/Sweet, which I suppose all melt various samples and sounds into incoherent experimental mush, though do so in completely different ways. Like how the first one has some guy talking about going to a party and re-hooking up with an ex or something in a slightly uncomfortable way, over some mildly vaporwave flavored drones. Or the fourth one is mostly glitched up violins and synths, or the third one takes a hip-hop break to speed up and down over a sea of loud field recordings from the city. Needless to say, this is one of the more unpredictable and odd projects I've come across this year, near impossible to sum up in a quick blurb. Maybe the pieces don't always feel like they really fit together that cohesively, but that feels like it could be part of the point and inspiration. Certainly keeps you guessing where anything might be going next. I don't foresee this being a long-term keeper. It's technically not even my favorite record in this sort of vein from this year, when there's also that 8 Ulentina project, which I think gets even more out of the box and gets all its pieces to fit together more cohesively. But I do like all of the individual parts of this album. The whole thing still grabbed my attention and stuck in my memory for how strange and creative it was, enough where I'm willing to recommend it to anyone to whom this sounds interesting. This is some neat stuff, and I'm overall feeling a 7.3 out of 10 on it. Next up from Skirkin, Nuts. Right, next random Bandcamp find comes from this Icelandic producer I'd previously never heard of until I just happened to see it charting decently high in the electronic tag on Bandcamp. I saw it was envisioned partially as a tribute to the late co-runner of the neo-tantra label, Arnie, and also thought the album cover looked cool, so I bought it on a whim. And it turned out to be really impressive. I plopped this thing on and got treated to some absolutely gorgeous synth melodies and cinematic pads joined by bouncy garage-adjacent beats and even some light trumpet accompaniment on opener After Sunset, which really caught me off guard. It was hitting me in the same way as some of the best and most energetic Phala tracks. And everything else on the album was just as high detail, organic sounding, and instantly emotionally investing with almost nothing in the way of misses, and all hitting in their own separate ways. A track like Remember combines piano and horns with breezy drum and bass beats, while the most direct tribute to Arnie, named directly after the label he managed himself, Moatun 7, that shows lots more bright but melancholic synth melodies and vocal chops going over another light burial-influenced groove. As does the track Midnight, which kinda has a similar blend. Meanwhile, a track like Monstrum Nox strips its sound down more to a simpler, Rival Consoles-ish techno framework with sound effects of footsteps walking through snow, and Shimmers on a Lake goes as propulsive and expansive as it can, with fast-paced beats, synth washes, glitched pianos, and more horns coming together in a mix that could rival a Reed Willis production. And the interlude, The Howitzer Hill Massacre, managed to set itself apart as a highlight through its darker mix of pure bass and beat work. The album does lose some steam for its final stretch as we get tracks like The Aftermath, The Interment, and Before Sunrise that get more simplistic and ambient-centric in their approaches. Not quite as attention-grabbing as what came before, but still hitting on the emotional notes they're going for. And yeah, that's about all I got. You don't hear a project as well textured as this every day, and it's going very overlooked, so definitely make sure to give this one a shot if your tastes are anything like mine. It'll be a particularly good mood for this coming winter, and I'm overall feeling an 8.3 out of 10. Next up from Werka, Unsung Irregular. Alright, next random Bandcamp find is this Manchester-based producer who made a pretty nice selection of grooving crossovers between electronic, jazz, and instrumental hip-hop adjacent styles, with a lot of tasty string backing, making an album very loosely inspired by his suffering from scoliosis, both the chronic pain and healing journey that might come with that. I suppose this isn't too sonically far away from the Skirkin thing I just got done talking about, though you're never gonna mistake them for each other. This definitely has more of a playful energy and is much more about groove than atmosphere. A track like opener S-Bend hits you with lots of bouncy blends of buzzing and bleeping synths and drum machines that feel surprisingly organic, especially aided by the bass guitar plucking for the hook and the string backing. And it's both kind of melodically unstable and strange, but also kind of fun and upbeat. And that's kind of the tone for what you get on this whole album. Tracks can take spins on those sorts of formulas, like the darker and more driving By Helm, the foot-tappingly off-kilter Irregular You that has these chopped-up grunting noises in the background of its strangely shuffling stop-start beats, or the quirky jazz-influenced hip-hop beats of Toast Rack or Humor This. There's also two tracks with quite solid soul singer guest performances in Narrow In with Dowdy Matsiko and Every Day with Riodnach Connolly. Sorry for butchered pronunciations. The latter is definitely one of the bigger highlights for me, as the lighter and breezier approach and the way all the vocals stack up and layer over each other in multi-tracked chorus sections is quite fun. Now, this album isn't quite as sonically impressive or organically immersive as, say, the Yarni album I was talking about near the beginning of this video. Some cuts here hit better than others. The handful of interludes scattered around are cool but don't really grab my attention, and the album definitely starts stronger than it ends. But there's nothing that actively gets in the way of my enjoyment either, and the particular blend of styles and influences does feel pretty unique. And it's quite short and to the point. I can just put this on and get about a half hour of lively and emotionally resonant synth and string-backed fun. So yeah, don't really know what else to say, besides this was a really nice time anytime I put it on. It's definitely worth giving a shot if all that sounds like it'd be your cup of tea. I can let this off with a 7.7 out of 10. Next up from Extravelt, Distortion. Alright, Extrawelt are a German minimal techno and electro duo who've been around technically since the early 2000s if you count the work they did under other aliases, and who have picked up quite a bit of hype over the years. I'd heard about them a number of times in the past, occasionally mixing them up in my head with Legovelt, to whom there's no actual relation that I know of. But I only actually looked into their work for the first time after I saw someone mention in my comments that they had this new album that just came out. They only released 4 other studio albums under this name, so I did make sure to at least catch myself up on those. While I wasn't really a huge fan of their debut from 2008, out of finding it to be overly simplistic and dragged out to the point of getting pretty tedious, the other 3 were all pretty solid for what they were. In Aufruhr in 2011 was a noticeable step up with more variety on their standard minimal techno formulas, may or may not be their best one. Either that or Fear of an Extra Planet in 2017, which had a bit more of an organic feel to it with some occasional guitars and more of a sense of forward momentum. And Unknown in 2018 was kind of more traditional electro in the old Doppler effect adjacent framework. I don't know if I would say any one of them hit me as like an all-timer or anything, but they're all enjoyable. I can respect what they do. Anyway, this latest album, Distortion, kinda carries off what they did back on Fear of an Extra Planet. Still a techno album at its core, but with some underlying rock influences in some of the choices of live-sounding drum textures, electric bass lines, and the way the synths are presented with those distorted guitar-like edges, or occasionally even just bringing in guitars. I guess it's not too far away from, say, like what John Tejada did with his album The Watchline earlier this year, although with a lot more focus on groove and swagger than atmosphere or deeper emotional resonance. So it didn't hit me on nearly as deep a level as The Watchline, but hey, there were still plenty of solid bangers to be found throughout this thing. These guys definitely know how to execute some pretty exciting build-ups and drops and put together some strong, danceable grooves. My favorite track on here is definitely their crossover with Jimmy Jules called Clapland. The live bass lines, light kalimba backing, and live-sounding disco drumming that probably had the most exciting sense of forward momentum out of any track on this thing. Though other highlights include the filthy acid bass and dramatic chord stabs running through No Pasaran, the rollicking ascending progressions of No Song for the Dead, the string-backed sorta interlude Sir String-A-Lot, and a solid handful of tracks which do introduce some more tender and warm plinky keyboard melodies, most welcoming sounding on Surrounded by Miracles, but spun around to sound more mysterious and odd on tracks like the opener Grand Départ or Hope Sounds Good. There are also plenty of tracks which just kind of fall in the background and just deliver techno grooves in the same style as other tracks on here without standing out. And the track Reverse Curse delivering this, like, drunk-sounding and lifeless rock ballad groove is a bit of an underwhelming finish for me. I think the penultimate track, Schöne Aussichten, would have made for a stronger and more uplifting closer, personally. But whatever, not that big a deal. This album is not anything that life-changing for me, but I had fun with all of it for what it was going for. If you are a minimal techno fan and this all sounds like it would be up your alley, then give it a shot. I'm overall feeling a 7.3 out of 10 on it. Next up from Fallgrap, Anthropos.
Ten strach, bolaby są dziewczę, se samobita, nie czeka na doski.
Wow, okay, this was one I had been really looking forward to and I just completely missed out on it. Fallgrap are a Slovakian trip-hop outfit who a long time ago I once covered in a Patreon request video. Someone sent in their 2014 debut album Rijeka to review, and I thought it was great. It still sits among my very favorite albums I've ever covered through Patreon request. This band had a blend of, like, energetic beats adjacent to garage and classic dubstep styles, but with super lush instrumental backing, including strings and harps and stuff, and phenomenal female vocal performances, and super strong and sticky melodic hooks that just absolutely floored me on first listen. I still have the whole thing on my iPod to this day. All the lyrics may be in Slovak and I don't understand a word of them, but you don't need to know any Slovak to be able to deeply connect with it anyway. If you've never heard it before, I would still absolutely recommend it. They have released a couple of albums since then, which I admittedly still haven't heard in their full entirety yet, although the bits that I kinda like briefly previewed through sounded about equally as pretty and striking. Although this was their first album to come out after they went independent from their previous home label, Gergaz. It originally came out all the way back in March, though since they didn't put it on Bandcamp, I ended up not realizing it had actually come out until right near the end of the year. Anyway, this new album of theirs is pretty interesting, I suppose. It's definitely recognizable as the same group who made Rieka, with more garage beats, strings, very pretty female vocals. Although there's also plenty of tracks that include male vocals, as well as a bit of an indie tone. There's one track with a guest rapper, Phobia Kid, who I assume is rapping entirely in Slovak. And some of the tracks get a little more strange and experimental, with some odd change-ups in the middle of the tracks. I'd think they were trying to expand their range and go out of their comfort zone, although the bits I've heard of their two albums in between this and Rieka show them kind of like naturally progressing in this direction. So this is kind of a continuation of how they were evolving their style already. It's not actually their first time to bring in a guest rapper, it was just the first time I had heard them do that. With that said, while this album's continuing to branch out from their original core appeal is interesting, I do feel like the results can be pretty hit and miss at times and don't always play to their strengths. They could sometimes come off like the Slovak equivalent to the band Halos, if you remember them. Which is not necessarily a bad thing to sound like. I did really like that Halos album I reviewed a while back as well. But they don't feel as much like their own unique and fresh thing as they did before. The melodies are still emotionally resonant, but not quite as sticky or memorable. They're wearing their influences more on their sleeve, and can occasionally come off like the kind of band who would be the opening act for a bigger name. The album doesn't really start out with a home run. Opener Nebo feels a little too much like a mainstream crossover attempt for my liking. Some of the low-key ballads, like Domov 1 or the closer Krasa, are nice and enveloping, but don't have among the strongest of tunes. And Domov 2 is a little odd trip-hop cut that had some chipmunk vocals that threw me off a bit. Also, the two Domov cuts don't really sound like two parts of the same whole to me. But there are still highlights as well. The rap track in question, Ave, was actually one of my biggest favorites, since I really liked the strange, darker and more percussive detour it provided, as well as its odd change-ups into chopped-up vocal harmonies. Sama V Sebe goes for this kinda faster-paced 80s-inspired groove and one of the stronger melodic hooks. And there's two tracks which go for heavily burial-inspired garage beats in Nesa Stavis and Bez Bez Bez. Sorry for butcher pronunciations on all these titles, by the way. The former has another one of the strongest hooks, and the latter is one of the thickest and heaviest and most epic bangers in the bunch. But my favorite track is definitely Zbliska. This is the track that most exemplifies the kind of appeal I would have specifically come to a new Fallgrap album for, with the especially passionate female vocal performance and the lesser string backing. But they also do this like really cool glitchy drum and bass influence thing in the second half of the track, which caught me off guard in the best way. Overall, this album is kind of an all-over-the-place mixed bag that doesn't really come together all that cohesively. Although, even if some aspects of this thing were maybe a mild disappointment, I still came away from it both with some major highlights that ended up making it worth the price of admission, as well as with some pretty big left hooks that I wasn't expecting but still went over really well for what they were. So I think there's enough here to say that this is a pretty good album, just not necessarily a great one, and I'm overall feeling a solid 7 out of 10 on it. Next up from Bicep, Chroma 000. I'm not really sure what possessed me to want to check out a new Bicep project. Historically, I found the original music from this UK duo of producers to be fine enough, but nothing too interesting in the greater context of the dance music world, and I never really got the hype behind them. I had a suspicion they might be better DJs or a better live act than standalone producers. Though I suppose in the wake of Daniel Avery's work finally starting to click with me after years of kind of dismissing him for similar reasons, I wanted to see if there was something I might have been missing with Bicep as well, and seeing this compilation of singles they put out over the course of the past 2 years or so, adding up to what's being considered their third studio LP, I decided, well, let's give them another chance with an open mind. And this project was fine, I guess. Yeah, this wasn't exactly the revelatory experience the new Daniel Avery thing was. Kinda just did more to reconfirm the same feelings I've already had on their music before. Though, it wasn't terrible or anything either. It was decent, and it did have its moments I did quite enjoy. When the project started out with a mix of shouty vocal snippets and break beats on opener Chroma 001 Helium, leading into the catchy rave bop of Chroma 002 Lava, with its sticky "making me feel" hook, I actually got pretty excited for what I was about to hear on this thing, and how those tracks did go pretty hard and feel pretty tightly constructed for what they were, even if they were immediately followed by a track like like Chroma 003 BI83, which had such a rudimentary blend of dance beats and sleepy and tedious melodic arpeggios that reminded me, oh yeah, that's why I've never been into these guys that much. And while much of the album stuck to mixes of somewhat underpowered trancey melodies, run-of-the-mill blends of techno beats and classic break beats and occasional deep-voiced vocal snippets that didn't really grab my attention that much, there were other cuts here I thought were quite solid too, like Chroma 007 Steel, which had a particularly epic build-up which I thought was quite well executed and exciting. Chroma 008 Tangs went for like a early 2000s dubstep and garage adjacent approach with some much slower and heavier beats and some pretty solidly atmospheric vocal contributions from Eliza. The same Eliza that sang on the Disclosure song You and Me all those years ago, by the way. Also, while Chroma 005 Aloe had some of the better melodic progressions not being put to as interesting use as they could over some more beatless arrangements, when that track got a remix version later in the album and given an actual backbeat for Chroma 011 Aloe 2, that was way more exciting and might have even been the best track in the bunch. The more breakbeat-centric remix of Tangs at the end wasn't really an improvement on the original, but whatever. Overall, I'm probably not going to remember this album exists or come back to any of it. I still don't think Bicep are bringing like anything to the standard dance formulas that their inspirations from the 90s weren't already doing way better for years. But I can't really get mad at this stuff either. All of it is competently put together for what it is. There were a few proper bangers here, and I suppose it'll all be going over better in a live setting anyway. I don't think this is going to make any new fans of Bicep that weren't already fans, but I suspect that existing fan base will be pleased by what they get here, so I guess take that all as you will. It's fine. Solid 6 out of 10. But if you want a better alternative to this kind of thing, next up from Kelly Lee Owens, Kelly EP. This was a neat surprise, coming off the heels of Kelly Lee Owens making an album of her dreamiest and most melodic work yet last year. We got this EP, which shows her turning in like almost the exact opposite direction and delivering some of her most aggressive and hard-hitting club-ready material to date. Just hitting you with lots of drilling bass, acid, and banging techno beats. It's not any more innovative than the Bicep thing, and the track 132 Techno, despite having some decently nice melodic arpeggios, wasn't really that attention-grabbing for me. Bangs hard enough, but not that special as far as regular techno goes. Although the other three tracks grabbed me a lot more. Hearing Owen's airy voice over all the fuzzy growling bass on Ascend was really exciting. Descend had a bunch of dubstep bass wobbling and breakbeat flavors, which was really neat. And then Lose Your Head almost did away with all the melody entirely and somehow ended up maybe being the catchiest and most visceral cut of all of them. That groove makes her old track Melt look like a meditation tape by comparison. So yeah, this EP was a good time. Nothing earth-shattering by the standards of this genre, but certainly allowed Kelly Lee Owens to explore a new side of her sound which she hadn't really touched on in the same way before. If you're a fan of her stuff and hadn't heard this one yet, I can definitely recommend giving it a spin. I'm overall feeling a 7.3 out of 10 on it. Next up from ED, Arrival 2003. Alright, this was a pretty fun album if you're looking for some fun disco and future funk type material. I'd never heard of this artist before, but I came across this album after seeing some reissues of old St. Pepsi records showing up in the top of the Bandcamp charts, and then seeing the label hosting said reissues, My Pet Flamingo, were also pushing this album that just came out this past November, so I just sampled through it on a whim and ended up liking what I heard enough to want to give it a quick shout in this video. The opening stretch of this album in particular really struck me as being really strong. Cuts like 20 Years Gone, The Millennium, Return to Mars, and the title track all pull from some really lush retro 70s disco samples with horn sections and strings and stuff, and nail down some really strong grooves that will very much hit the spot if you're looking to get your St. Pepsi itch scratched. The title track in particular had a pretty solid vocal hook as well. And while that little 4-track run in the beginning was the best part of the album by some distance, and the project as a whole might have lost a bit of steam by the very end, the rest of it was still all quite solid for what it was. The track I'm Attached to You sounds like it took one of the samples used by an earlier track on the album but formed a new hook out of it. And Wanna Do City had another one of the catchiest vocal hooks, all presumably in Japanese because of course. And there were some more down-tempo vaporwavy interludes scattered around as well, which maybe were a bit of a mixed bag. I wasn't crazy about Rocket Science, and the closer You're Here With Me, while a serviceable emotional note, felt like a slight bit of an anticlimax. So the album intro Belantes with all its lush strings and the jazzy interlude Sierra Echo Foxtrot were quite nice. Overall, this album's probably not going to change anyone's life, but there are definitely some gems on this thing that make it worth giving a spin, especially if you are a big future funk and vaporwave kind of person and want a little more digestible and understated package than what DJ Sabrina can deliver. It's some solid stuff. I'm overall feeling a 7.5 out of 10 on it. Next up from Space Laces, Voltage 004. Alright, next up I guess it's time for me to do my periodic checkup on what's going on in the EDM and bass music scenes. I saw this project getting a lot of buzz over there and decided to give it a spin out of curiosity. Truth be told, I know Space Laces has been around for a minute at this point, since like the early 2010s, back when American-style dubstep was at its peak. He's worked with artists like Excision and was a regular on the Never Say Die label back in the day, although I had never personally heard of him until earlier this year when he made an appearance on that most recent SickElixir album, and this is the only full project I've ever heard from the guy. Technically, this is a mixtape. The sticker on the album cover says it's compiled together out of demos and rarities from his vault, hence the title, I guess. Though the experience is very much in the exact same vein as that last SickElixir album, right down to being made out of a shit ton of track fragments, only one of which is 3 minutes, and the rest of which range from 1.5 minutes to 30 seconds, but are all mashed together in a single continuous mix. And yeah, it was a really fun time. I think I enjoyed this about equally as much as that last SickElixir album. Doesn't have any high points quite as high as that album, but it did feel a bit more varied, and it didn't have a bunch of DJ chatter in between every other track that got old, so I guess that evens out. There's obviously no point in breaking down every track here, but there weren't any cuts that were like an active turn-off. I mean, maybe the worst one was Freak Mode, since it hyped itself up as activating Freak Mode, and then the drop is just kind of a rinky-dink anticlimax, which is like one of the least freaky moments on the album, but even that was fine. It's only a minute long anyway, so who cares? If you want some actual highlights, the intro is pretty dramatic. The run of Force Majeure, Rewind, and Killdozer all had progressively more hard-hitting and danceable drops in those early 2010s electro house modes. And the 1-2 punch of Keep It Cool and Tank hit in much the same way, even if they were basically the same track. Sorcery had some fun horror movie horn section samples, and its solid drop carried over into Revenge pretty well. Tunnels lives up to its title with its deeper tunneling bass. I guess Garfield with Getter was one of the more fleshed out and dynamic feeling cuts. Some of the crazier and more detailed drops showed up on Soul Crush and Razor Sharp with G. Jones. And the 3-minute closer Untouchable can be a highlight by default just for feeling like a complete thought that wasn't cut up between 3 different tracks. Although there's a whole run of fragments on this album which really stands out to me as my favorite stretch of this thing, and I do think can briefly cross over into greatness. Starting with 5-6, haha, almost little kid memes, but its breakbeats and undulating bass drops really grab my attention. It then goes into the stabby cyber step, and then really grabs me even more, starting with Spellbreaker, which had all these brighter melodic stabs, and Loose Ends, which turned those melodies into this even more uplifting bouncy house cut. Signals add some aggressive drilling synths over a garage beat. Whip It pulls away the melody, but lets the bass and dance groove carry itself, but then introduces the next track guest feature with the sample fittingly describing him as the walking piss from the piss of hell. That would be none other than Marshmello on the track Bomb. And I can't believe I'm saying this, but Marshmello's appearance was actually one of my favorite parts on the album. I don't think I've ever heard a Marshmello track I've thought fell outside of the range of mediocre to terrible in my entire life. This has to be the first time ever that I've actually liked, let alone tolerated a track with that guy's name on it. Maybe it helps that it's only a minute, but that minute could have been stretched out to 3 and I would have still been happy with how those big synth organ chords and wobbly bass drops go up next to each other. It's pretty epic. So yeah, Voltage 004 was an all-around fun time for what it was. Nothing revolutionary and probably not going to be a long-term keeper, but I quite effectively got my early 2010s EDM nostalgia fix with it, and if that genre is your bag and you are waiting for my recommendation to hear it for whatever reason, I can also co-sign it as being worth giving a shot. I'm overall feeling a 7.5 out of 10 on it. Next up from Seeming, The World.
I am an animal.
God damn, okay, this one caught me a little off guard. Seeming, the New York-based darkwave and synth-pop band primarily helmed by Alex Reed, is an act I'd been aware of for a little while. I vaguely remembered his 2020 album, The Birdwatcher's Guide to Atrocity, got a lot of good reviews at the time, though my first time actually hearing any of his work wasn't until earlier this year when he made a guest appearance on that most recent Coma Duster comeback album, on the track The Less You Know. That was definitely one of the better and more memorable tracks from that album, and when I saw this latest project get a glowing review from Marc from Spectrum Pulse, I thought, damn, okay, I should check this one out. I have not heard anything else from Seeming aside from that guest feature and this album, but it didn't take me too long to arrive at the conclusion that this album is amazing, and it's probably going to be notching a pretty high spot on my year-end list. Super bombastic synth pop and darkwave with lots of big dramatic faux cinematic mixes of synths and heavy 80s drums, fantastically sticky melodic hooks on every track, and most importantly some very overt anti-fascist messaging highlighting the urgency of the state of the world we live in and how everything we know and love is in danger from the rise of fascism and climate change. But also that we the people still have the power to make a change and reverse course. That good people need to keep standing up and fighting and pushing back, and even that some extreme actions may be necessary to respond to the extremity of the current institutions. All framed as inspirationally as possible and just reminding you of how badass it is to actually fight the power, as it were, for the sake of protecting the good left in the world. I might even be somewhat oversimplifying things. I'm not going to be able to come up with a better analysis of this album's lyrics than that of what Marc already said in his video, but it is interesting that he highlighted this album's supposed total lack of coolness through its especially theatrical and over-the-top presentation, clean synth-backed production style, and the complete, full-hearted sincerity with which Alex Reed delivers every line on this thing. Because when I put this on, I thought this was actually extremely cool. I suppose coolness is in the eye of the beholder. I personally believe that A, there's few things cooler to me than anti-fascism this bravely overt and in your face, and B, being a darkwave synth-pop album and all, this album ended up doing a lot to appeal to my fandom for the forefathers of this genre, Depeche Mode. They always make their theatricality feel cool to me, and the theatricality of this project hits me more in the same vein as them, albeit turned up a few notches. I guess it kinda hit to me like an alternate universe version of Depeche Mode's attempt to address the modern political climate on Spirit in 2017, but an actual great version of what they were attempting to do without any of the major issues I had with that album. If it had even better hooks, a lot more energy, and most importantly was the complete polar opposite in terms of its attitude, actually trying to inspire people to make the world a better place and actively pushing against the defeatist everything is fucked nihilist mindset instead of openly wallowing in defeatism. I'm probably doing Seeming a pretty big disservice making a comparison to Spirit at all, but you know, it was something that came to mind. All 11 tracks on this thing are really good and could all be considered highlights, but some of the more consistent hitters for me personally include the trumpet-backed Heart of Hunger, the visceral and pummeling Zebra Tramples Horse Trainer. Those two are probably the catchiest hooks on here. I also like some of the synth xylophones running through the background of Tomorrow Place. I like the big dramatic pianos on Shackleton. The album's most hard-hitting bangers were probably the opener A Failure of Imagination, which really grabs your attention right away, as well as the even more fast-paced, cyberpunky tone of Any Other World, and a couple of tracks that had some mildly strange instrumental choices that I thought were particularly interesting, like the reverse chopped-up samples of strings and off-kilter beats on Grind Show, or the swirling woodwinds and big dulcimer melodies on Spiral. Also, the track Assassin's Love Song makes for a strong, quieter, emotional moment, written from the perspective of someone who's presumably going to be facing some kind of punishment for their crimes against the state, but who has no regrets, and said crime is framed as having been for the greater good of humanity. So yeah, that's about all I have to say about The World. This album got better and better every time I put it on. Are there other albums out there that appeal more to me from a sound design and stylistic level? Sure, but the melodies and hooks as well as the anti-fascist messaging made it super immediate, and it's almost certainly gonna end up among my favorites of the year. Definitely make sure to check this one out. I think I'm overall feeling a very light 8.5 out of 10 on it. Next up from Birdsnake, Biofilter. Alright, next up we got an album from an Australian outfit that appeals very directly to a very different set of my personal sensibilities. They're delivering an especially organic sounding blend that hits both on my love for ambient dub in the SFTG adjacent mold, as well as my love for ambient techno, and the whole project is very well textured and engaging all the way through, really adding up to that sort of aquatic Frutiger Arrow type aesthetic. And each of the 10 tracks add something unique of interest to the overall mix. Opener Rare Amulet and Bug Bite shower you in all sorts of kalimbas and harps, going over minimal dubby down-tempo beats, and the latter starts bringing in a breezier and jazzier beat on top and fills its mix out with more bass. Later on, the track Hydrostatic Pressure provides an even more energetic and stomping and expansive spin on the latter track's blend. Beyond that, Scintillate in a Dark Blue Light takes more kalimbas and xylophones and flute, but places them over a more stomping techno arrangement with driving, almost Giorgio-like synth bass lines, and a few barely audible, warped spoken word passages in the background for texture, while Slipstream adheres more to icier dub techno formulas. Orange 367 floats through lots of expansive and dreamy synth textures and harps, and even light saxophones going up next to acid-y bass lines that all add up to a very Phala-ish vibe, before making a big switch up in its outro into this kind of minimal lo-fi hip-hop adjacent beat, accompanied only by reverb-covered vibraphones. Hell yeah, that's really nice. The saxophones also make a comeback for the not really interlude Ancient Signal as well. The title track acts as a sort of interstitial moment, but still hits you with lots of pretty and well-layered synth washes before finishing with lots of processed bubbling water sound effects. The penultimate track, Mariana's Trench Coat, switches up to easily the most straightforward and propulsive techno blend of them all, and hits you with lots of bubbly dub techno synth riffs and echoing vocal snippets, while the groove stomps away underneath over an extended 7-minute arrangement. That's a pretty epic climax for the album. And finally it closes with The Slow Dance of Kelp, which provides a blend of mildly flatter and sharper synth arpeggios, bouncing off lots of marimbas. Maybe not a climactic hitter to close things out, but it's got a mix that stands out in context anyway. These guys may not be delivering anything you haven't heard before in this genre. It's not exactly among the biggest emotional heavy hitters I've heard this year, but I really got wrapped up in all the super organic mixes of sounds they were delivering, and I think it's some of the best material I've heard in this particular vein this year. Can definitely give this my recommendation. I'm overall feeling a solid 8 out of 10 on it. Next up, from Voices from the Lake, 2. Voices from the Lake are an ambient techno duo from Italy consisting of Donato Dazzi and Neil, who once put out a self-titled album all the way back in 2012 and apparently got a lot of acclaim from it. I'd personally never heard of them until they just released this sophomore album here following it up. Someone in my comments recommended it to me, and suddenly I saw over 1,000 people had bought it off of Bandcamp on site, including whoever runs the Strangely Isolated Place label. Apparently this act was a whole bunch of people's entry point getting into ambient techno in the first place. Okay, I had no idea these guys were that big a deal. Having now caught up on their first album, while I wouldn't necessarily call it like a game changer or revolutionary, I can definitely see how it would have stuck out from the scene back in 2012. It may be extremely minimal and simplistic, but there was a very tactile, smooth, and organic feeling texture to the way they put together their beats and synths, and the way the whole project steadily evolved over time made it surprisingly easy to sink myself into and feel satisfied, despite how little was seemingly going on the surface. Hit me kind of in a similar way to that one Marc-E album from the 2000s. I don't think it's quite as good as that, but I can see how certain audiences were particularly drawn to it. Now, this sequel, while similar in tone, is a bit different. It's a bit more expansive in sound, it brings in brighter melodies and more organic texture. There's still plenty of tracks that maintain the same minimal but organic sound of the first album, like the stripped back opener Eos, the mysterious Bespin, or the bubbly Montanero. But other tracks have a lot more present melodies, like on the dynamic and cinematic Aquateo, probably my personal favorite cut. Also the spacey pads and blippy micro sound percussion on Manuark, or the humming blips going through Mono no Koto, or the especially icy closer Ian. Tracks like Blue Noah have a lot more forward momentum through their deeper bass lines, and tracks like Lotus Mist and Asterios bring in all this organic hand percussion that feels like it would have been right at home in that Birdsnake album I literally just got done talking about in the segment right before this. For the record, while I do think this album has slightly better melodies and obviously flows better than the Bird Snake thing, thanks to the inclusion of the continuous mix on this one, which, by the way, has like super smooth, full minute-long crossfades between tracks, so yeah, that's great. I would still say the Bird Snake thing is a fair bit better for me as a whole. It's much more diverse sound palette and more expansive variety and genre influences pulled in my attention a fair bit more consistently and felt more unique. Go check that album out, it's not getting nearly as much attention as this one. But I digress. This is admittedly an album where I feel like certain parts hit more for me than others. Basically, any of the more organic sounding cuts are the ones with the brighter melodies over the ones that sounded like what they did on the last album. But I think the experience is about on par with its predecessor enjoyment-wise for its own separate reasons. This year may have had absolutely no shortage of quality ambient techno and mildly new age flavored material, so I can't call this one of the biggest standouts of the year or anything, but I can at least see where the hype is coming from, and I definitely enjoyed my time with it enough to be feeling a very strong 7.5 out of 10. Next up from Tourist, Music is Invisible. Oh hey, Tourist is back with a new project. And it's a straightforward, no-frills trance album. I mean, if this had come out exactly 1 year before it did, I probably would have been, like, a lot more all over it. In the year when traditional trance made a full comeback, and artists like Factor B, Paul Van Dyke, and Solarstone, among plenty of others, were already putting out lots of quality this year, this might not quite hit as special a note as it might have otherwise. Not to mention the 10 tracks on this album sound almost identical. I can't say it's among the most exciting trance project I've heard this year. Still, Tourist's knack for hitting on really strong emotional notes and sentimentality makes him a perfect fit for regular old trance music, so all of this still hits on the level it's going for. In terms of highlights, the sort of title track and opener Invisible has a neat sample talking about how music can reach those transcendental heights without requiring any kind of visual accompaniment, hence the album's title. Outside has a lot of hard-hitting house pianos. Sparks and Veil were probably the most expansive and atmospheric cuts here. In Unison was the hardest hitting banger and had me like really headbanging along with it. Love in Silence brought in some male vocals care of Real Lies, which made for a nice change up into the album's otherwise single-minded focus. I do kind of wish this stuff gave me more to say than it did. It's all just regular old trance music in the same frameworks you've heard before. And while Tourist's melodic songwriting style is a great fit for the genre, he's also not bringing that unique a personality to these sounds either. He definitely got unlucky with this year, suddenly having a lot of better and more interesting traditional trance music coming in and rendering this maybe a little redundant in comparison. But I can't get mad or really complain too much about what he did here either, since it's all really well-made trance music with really strong melodies. So, I guess take that all as you will. I don't know if I'm going to remember this longer term, but I enjoyed it enough to give it my recommendation anyway if you happen to be a trance fan like I am. I'm overall feeling a strong, solid 7 out of 10 on it. Next up from ASC, Vanishing Point. And here's the last random Bandcamp find I have to mention today. So, ASC is a California-based producer who makes atmospheric drum and bass. Now, I love me some atmospheric drum and bass, although it is one of the easiest genres to come by on Bandcamp these days. Projects in this vein rarely give me that much of substance to actually say, especially those of the standard 90s and Y2K throwback variety trying to sink themselves in like nostalgic PS1 era aesthetics. Shout out to artists like Pizza Hotline and Arcologies, who have given me nice relaxing times and absolutely nothing in the way of discussion material. Also more recently there was an album from TB, I can throw that in, that was a little more banger-centric, marginally closer to the noisia side of that genre, I guess. Though that guy's also been around since the 90s. Anyway, point is, I hear music like what ASC delivers all the time, your big expansive cinematic synth washes, amen breaks, the works. And it doesn't often inspire me to like want to write about it. So I don't know if this album just happened to catch me at a good time, But there was something about this one in particular that happened to inspire me to include it here, actually reminding me a bit more of that magical feeling I remember feeling back in the day when, I first heard Beatie's The Road to Lostwithiel. The 8 tracks here may be functionally the exact same, but there's also just barely enough variation in execution for me to be able to tell them apart. Opener Mystic Street had some more chill guitars and jazzy electric pianos going up next to its choir pads and echoing vocal samples, setting the tone for the project well. Convergence was more stripped back, though I think I heard a sax solo in there. Invisible Borders has the thickest blend of pads and the most crashing amen breaks. Celestial Bodies combines its classic jungle breaks with more synth bells. Losing Track of Time had some particularly emotional synth strings in there. The whole album can make me lose track of time, so that's fitting. And Slipstream might somehow get even deeper and more cosmic with a similar sound. Paradigm Shift's pads and vocal samples are a bit more impressively monolithic, if not as dynamic. And finally, Transmitter strips itself back down to the spaciest essentials with some radar blip-like melodies. So, yeah. That's about it. The fact that this entire album sticks to its one single well-worn genre formula does prevent me from recommending it even higher. There is absolutely no sound that ASC provides on this album that hundreds of artists over the decades haven't already done plenty of times. Though I haven't heard the execution of this formula done this well since, I don't know, the first time I heard an album by Alluvia a couple of years ago. It did really wrap me up in its spacey atmosphere. The melodies were all really nice, and the fact that it did stand out to me even after I've gotten maybe a bit more numb to hearing albums in this formula, I think that does have to count for something. So yeah, if you're a fan of atmospheric drum and bass, definitely make sure to check this out. I'll give this a strong 7.5 out of 10. Next up from Mum, History of Silence. Wow, this wasn't a name I've thought about in a very, very long time. Mum are an Icelandic band known for combining IDM and downtempo with post-rock and indie rock, and who broke out in the early 2000s. Sometimes regarded as pioneers of the genre label Indie-tronica, if that means anything to you. There's a blog-era term if there ever was one. When I was in high school, I once picked up a single song from this band called Green Grass of Tunnel when I found it in an iTunes Essentials playlist, mostly out of thinking the title sounded cool, and I remember its down-tempo mix of synths and guitars with mildly cutesy, half-whispered vocals I could barely understand, becoming a pretty frequent go-to if I was in the mood for something warm and cozy. I listened to it a decent bit back in the day, but I never got around to hearing any of the band's other critically acclaimed work. And considering they hadn't released a full studio album since all the way back in 2013, I'd barely thought about them or seen anyone talk about them aside from maybe pitchfork lists and that kind of thing. But when they just broke that 12-year hiatus this year and came back with their 7th studio album here, I was like, you know what, I think I gotta catch myself up on this band. They seem like a pretty important influence on certain scenes I care about, and like the kind of band I should know more about than I do. So I went back and listened to all their previous albums, and here's my quick thoughts on those. This may have come out right at the end of 1999, but the mix of influences from IDM, microsound glitch, post-rock, and instrumental folk, all creating a very laid-back and pleasant but high-detail experience, like some kind of handcrafted electronic embroidery, to sort of steal a metaphor Björk made once. It feels very much predictive of the direction the entire IDM scene would go in the 2000s, as artists like Fortet, Caribou, Rumpistol, Ilke, and Mira Kalix, among others, would come along to do stuff in a similar vein shortly afterwards. Bit background music-y and samey in some points, but you're hit with tons of fascinatingly glitchy mixes and neat instrumental choices, and a few creatively off-kilter sound effect blends thrown in there. It's really nice. I can see how it attained its classic status. Though this is the album that really broke them out to a wider audience. This shows them combining the abstract IDM sound of their debut with some more accessible pop elements and a bit more presence from the vocals. And yeah, it's excellent. Having the one track I already knew may have given this a bit of a nostalgia boost, but setting that aside, adding those pop and folk elements to an otherwise very abstract electronic album at its core gave this stuff even deeper emotional resonance than before and clicked with me right away. Immediately got the hype for this one. Like the last album, but darker and spookier with a bit more focus on the folksier elements. I feel like the vocals somehow got even more cutesy and high-pitched than before, to maybe a level that might get slightly grating sometimes. It's not as big a home run as their first two albums, but it's still quite nice. Small lineup change for this one with a new lead singer. It's like the last album, but more cheerful and nostalgic on average, and even more focused on the folksier elements to the point where it's barely even electronic at all anymore. Not my thing as much, but it's got its moments. Like the last album, but even more songwriter-centric, a bit more cleanly produced, and it's a bit more obvious that the singer is different. Some moments are still a bit too twee and cutesy for my liking, especially the opener, which feels like reading a children's picture book. But there are also some legit heartbreaking moments on here, so I guess that evens out. Oh hey, this one finally brings back the electronic sounds in a much more obvious way. It's also probably their lightest, fluffiest, and most accessible work yet, like a lo-fi bedroom synth-pop record in a Postal Service adjacent vein, with some occasional strings and stuff stuck in some corners. It's probably my favorite project they've put out since their first two. And there's even a bonus track with Kylie Minogue of all people, so that's neat. Which brings us to here. Yeah, this mini marathon was really nice. I got pretty immediately where this band gets their hype from and understood how their first two classics are regarded as highly as they are. But also, I like how they made sure to never make the exact same album twice. Anyway, even though it's been 12 years since their last record, this comeback shows them continuing that trend of not wanting to make the same album twice. While the blend of pianos, guitars, and synths and the like is recognizable as the same band you know, this is definitely not a nostalgic throwback to the sound and approach that first made them popular and acclaimed. Instead, this shows them stripping their sound down to the single quietest and lowest energy blend they've delivered to date. Nothing but the most achingly sad ballads about the loss of innocence and stuff, carrying the most depressing and downbeat mood any of their albums has ever had. Now, I'll admit that on first listen I wasn't really feeling it, maybe found it to be a mildly fitting mood for 2025, but it felt so lifeless and borderline lethargic to me. Although, the more times I did put it on, it did start to grow on me a bit, as I could glean some appeal out of it adjacent to, say, Rum Pistols After the Flood or something. The most stripped back ballads like Mild at Heart or Kill the Light still kind of fall a little flat for me and feel a bit aimless. But the quietly dramatic synth bass joined by strings and simple harmonized vocal refrains on Miss You Dance did click with me. I thought Avignon was probably the best of the more regular piano ballady tracks, at least had the most tastefully complex chord progression. And in the second half of the album, they do bring in enough synths to remind you that yes, they are still an electronic band. Only Songbirds Have a Sweet Tooth is the album's most energetic moment. Initially didn't hit me right, as I wasn't crazy about some of the vocal effects, but that stopped bothering me after enough listens. Our Love Is Distorting has the album's loudest build-up with synths and noise, kind of bringing in some shoegaze influence maybe. A Dry Heart Needs No Winding, felt like it could get something oddly driving out of an otherwise minimal synth piano and guitar arrangement. And finally, the closer, I Like to Shake, shows the lead singer talking about shaking like a leaf amidst some of the most achingly funereal string sections. Maybe the track is a bit repetitive and overly simplistic, but I cannot say that it didn't leave an impression. And yeah, that's kind of everything on History of Silence. Was not what I expected to be hearing, and I don't know if the results always play to the band's strengths. I did compare it to Rum Pistol's more recent piano work, though this is definitely not on that level for me. It's both too scant on ideas and not tightly structured enough, with too many parts that just kind of meander a bit to compete with the likes of Isola. But hey, all of it is well crafted enough for what it's going for to be able to hit on the emotions they're intending to hit, and I respect the risk they took changing their sound like this, especially after so long a time out of the game. I wouldn't exactly call it a fun time, it's very much trying to be the opposite of that, but hey, if you want to wallow in pure sadness for about a half hour, this'll certainly do the trick well enough, and I'll let it off with a solid 7 out of 10. And finally, from DJ Sabrina, the Teenage DJ, Fantasy. Man, why did DJ Sabrina have to drop a 4-hour album in mid-December, almost completely throwing off my schedule right before year-endless season? Why couldn't she have waited a few more weeks and pushed this into January? I suppose if there is an upside, is that having just recently done that entire half-hour Patreon request video on the µ-Ziq 2 album and having heard her entire back catalog now, I do feel like I know exactly how to digest any new Sabrina albums. I know the chances of this album revealing anything new to me about Sabrina that I didn't already know or converting any fans that weren't already fans of her before are pretty much zero at this point. And as such, I felt safe enough writing up this segment after only giving this thing one full front-to-back listen, and maybe going back and previewing through other tracks. I had kind of gone in wishing I could spend more time with it to really pin down whether this is, like, maybe on par with the other two biggest scale Sabrina albums, Charmed and Destiny, which are my personal favorite albums of hers. Though, after my one listen, I concluded pretty quickly that no, it's not on that level for me. It's pretty much the status quo level of enjoyments that I would expect out of most other Sabrina albums. Which is to say, it's quite solid with plenty of highlights, but not absolutely mind-blowing all the way through. I feel like it's maybe about on par with her Hex album from last year. I think actually a little bit better than that one, but also not as good as the µ-Ziq 2 album. And I do consider Hex to be one of her better albums, so I'll certainly take that. So here we go, highlights. Opener All These Years is a good start. It's the exact Sabrina epic overstuffed Disney Channel house sound you would expect, but it hits, and there's some good sax solos in there. So Strong has some cool banging 80s electro influence. Throwdown is an unexpected turn for early 2010s style aggressive dubstep. That was pretty kick-ass. This song gets all airy and atmospheric in a cool way, and the title track gets particularly expansive and dreamlike in a way that hit a solid emotional note. Search for the Feeling On and On had these blocky EDM trance synths and I think some banjos in the background that was interesting. It builds into the pretty strong emotional house cut Tomorrow Comes, which stuck to the usual formula but still hit me well enough to be a standout anyway. And Hideaway was a solid momentum retaining transitional cut, I suppose. Not There Yet brings some Giorgio-type energy through its I Feel Love bass synth arpeggios and its epic 10-minute arrangement, and builds perfectly into Is This Love, which hit me with all these big, not really orchestral stabs and retro-futuristic video gamey synths, which were even more exciting. All That We Want switches over to a blend of early 90s hip-hop beats, acid, and acoustic guitar pop with a random organ solo in the middle, while Trey Cool Parts 1 and 2 make a bit of a country-influenced turn. Especially Part 2. Was maybe a little disappointed that Part 2 didn't have any relation to Airplane Song from µ-Ziq 2 album, despite both tracks being subtitled Welcome Home, but oh well. Fantasy Island was a nice little synthwave tune with nice MIDI-sounding sax solos, and it segues into the absolutely gorgeous jazzy turn that is Sunset Years, and pretty much the whole ending stretch from Dreams Come True onwards was all really strong emotional hitters. That track hit a big emotional note through some subtle orchestral flourishes. Been Down a Long Road hit a similar note through lots of punchy house pianos. Oh What a Feeling did the same with its denser synth cascades and vocal sample layering, and Rainfalls did so, both with its more tender instrumental as well as being the most expansive track out of them all at over 12 minutes. I did also get a mild chuckle upon finding out the hook of Is This Really Freedom Part 2 was a voice saying the full title, including the words Part 2. And there was also a later spoken admission that Part 1 may or may not exist on some other album some other day, so that's mildly amusing. And more importantly, the lush synth instrumental on that one was really nice and relaxed and well layered, and led well into the closer Forever and a Day, I Still Believe, which felt like it soundtracked the credits roll over the full experience, with some false endings leading to bigger drops that were cool. Now, there's plenty of not-so-great moments on this thing, too. With 40 tracks, you're guaranteed to run into a bunch of tracks that follow the usual Sabrina formula but don't provide an interesting enough spin to stick out to me in any way. See Another Wall, In My Eyes, Keep Wondering Why, Our Love Is Gone, among plenty of others. Or tracks that might have been interesting but just didn't quite hit right for me, like the 80s electro-influenced Fantasized, which had some kinda unflattering synthesized vocals, or Together and Say, which had an accordion on it, but wasn't anything of particular note otherwise. I was also left wishing the tracks with the Tame Impala-ish vocal guest hit better for me than they did, like Whatever You Have or Nothing's Done. The tunes are good, but the vocals are kinda weak. And if I had to pick a least favorite, I think it would ironically be the track My Favorite. That one reprises the hook from her old track All I Can Feel on Destiny. Yes, I had to do a bit of searching around to figure that out. And no, this version is not better in any way. It drowns that same hook in all these ugly filtered vocal effects that really don't sound great. Although I suppose that gave me more of an appreciation for a track that wasn't originally a big standout on Destiny. But yeah, that's about everything that I have to say about the finer details that go into fantasy. Absolutely nothing I haven't heard from Sabrina a gazillion times at this point. But the formula continues to hit about as well as it always has. I definitely came out of the experience satisfied with what I got and feeling it was quite solid. Was I feeling the length on it? Yes, of course. There were definitely stretches of this thing where I just wasn't really feeling it. The whole run from Fantasize through Whatever You Have comes to mind in particular as a pretty big lull. Though that is balanced out by the ending stretch and all the other big standouts scattered throughout as well. I mean, at the end of the day, I really wasn't feeling the length on this thing any more than I normally would on any other Sabrina album. So I suppose there's something to be commended for that. The fact that her 2-hour, 3-hour, and 4-hour albums all feel like they're about the same level of commitment for me. I will admit to being pretty numb to the way Sabrina albums are paced thanks to the massive marathon of her back catalog I went through earlier this year, but hey, the fact that I did get as used to it as I did is a testament to how high her floor of quality is. And there is at least like 20 or so tracks here where I was really getting into it. That is a lot of hits, and I'm not about to complain that I live in the universe where I got to hear tracks like Throw Down, Not There Yet, Is This Love, Sunset Years and Dreams Come True, among plenty of other hitters. Have I heard stronger and more consistent stuff out of Sabrina than this? Yes, this is not Destiny level for me. Could this grow on me further if I'm ever able or willing to make time to sit through the whole thing a second or even third time? It's possible. I could see it happening. But at the end of the day, it's just exactly the experience you'd expect it to be, and however much you think you're going to get out of it is how much you're going to get out of it. I personally thought it was all around pretty solid, and I think there was enough here where I'm willing to let it get away with a light 7.5 out of 10. And that is finally it. That is the roundup. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself that list. Link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.